Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, on Inauguration Day, our border was secure. The Trump policies had slowed illegal immigration to a trickle. But that afternoon, Joe Biden reversed these policies, and in the last 17 months, the Democrats have deliberately admitted into our country more than 2.1 million illegal aliens. Now, that is larger than the entire population of the state of Nebraska. And while the Border Patrol was overwhelmed, more than 1.5 million known gotaways entered as well. That's an additional population larger than that of Hawaii. All of this in 27 months. But as we can see at this very moment, this was only a prelude to the mass invasion now unfolding before our eyes. The Border Patrol Union warned us yesterday, quote, "Field reports from agents across the southern border verify the enormity of this tidal wave of illegal aliens coming now. Huge groups are overwhelming stations, and it is completely out of control. Massive releases beginning, and it's going to get much worse," end quote. Now, for Americans, this means classrooms packed with non-English speaking students, hospitals flooded with illegals demanding uncompensated care, violent criminal cartels and gangs introduced into our communities, fentanyl killing an average of 300 Americans every day, suppressed wages for working Americans, and the collapse of the social safety net that was supposed to take care of Americans in need. For the millions of illegal migrants, it means exposure to hazardous conditions that have claimed 2,000 lives that we know of. Many arrive sick, traumatized, starved, brutalized, raped, and deeply in debt to the cartels. These are not asylum seekers. Asylum is a specific refuge for those singled out by their government for persecution because of race, religion, or political beliefs. Asylum is achieved by crossing the first international border that separates you from that government. Asylum is not an open invitation to bum rush our borders, but the Democrats have made it precisely that. If you make a fraudulent asylum claim, you're now guaranteed to receive immediate admission into our country. You get cash, a range of free goods and services, indefinite residency, and indefinite work authorizations. And when your claim is ultimately rejected by a clogged court system years in the future, you'll not be deported, and you only need to wait for the next amnesty. This makes a mockery of legitimate asylum, the sovereignty of our nation, and the rule of law. Our bill removes the incentives to break our laws by reinforcing the existing requirement that forbids releasing asylum claimants into the country until their claim is resolved. This bill also returns unaccompanied minors safely home, as we already do with children from Mexico or Canada. But this administration sends all other children to poorly vetted so-called sponsors in this country with little concern or follow-up over the conditions into which we have abandoned them. Many become indentured servants, slaves to the cartels and their gangs, forced into sex trafficking, labor trafficking, drug trafficking under horrific conditions. The only way to stop this trafficking is to return these children safely home. The cartels are paid thousands of dollars to bring them to the United States, and that will stop the moment we return these children to their homes. Every Border Patrol agent I've talked to tells me that this is the only way to stop this heartbreaking tragedy. And for those crossing as families, this measure keeps them together. It allows them to make their asylum claim and then to wait in Mexico or in a family residential center until their claim is heard. This measure removes the incentives for cartels to traffic children to pose as families in order to be automatically released into our country, as the Democrats are doing. I want to thank Mr. Biggs, Mr. Roy, Mr. Calvert, Mr. Carter of Texas, Mr. Johnson of Louisiana, Mr. Tiffany, and Mr. Moran for their work that comprises the judiciary section of this bill, and my thanks to the many members who helped craft it into its current form. Yes, we are a nation of immigrants. We are also a nation of laws. Millions of immigrants come to our country legally every year. They obey our laws, they wait patiently, they do everything our country asks of them. But meanwhile, millions of illegal immigrants are cutting in line in front of them, aided, abetted, encouraged, and rewarded by Democratic officials. It's been said that this bill has no chance in the Senate, and that if it did pass, it would be vetoed by the President. Well, that is a question that the American people must ultimately decide before it is too late. And I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, today the majority has brought forward a cruel, extreme, and unworkable piece of legislation which would wreck our economy, destroy the asylum system, criminalize visa overstays, send unaccompanied children back to dangerous situations, and jail children indefinitely. Once again, my Republican colleagues show us that they are not interested in finding real solutions to tough issues. This bill attempts to combine a variety of different bills, each one more cruel and heartless than the last, into one contradictory and overlapping mess. This bill has no chance of being enacted into law, and it is nothing more than pure political theater. My Republican colleagues are trying to take us back to the failed, illegal, and immoral policies of the Trump administration. Former President Trump's radical, inhumane, and racist immigration actions weakened the U.S. economy, undermined our moral standing in the world, and did not make us any safer. While trampling on some of our most deeply held American values, his erratic approach also failed to stem the flow of migrants across our border. Let's be very clear about what this legislation would do. When taken together, this bill serves as a wholesale ban on asylum. No one would be able to seek asylum in the United States if they crossed between ports of entry or if they had or could have had even temporary status in a third country. Let me give you an example of what this means. If the Russian dissident Alexei Navalny, whom Putin attempted to poison twice, was somehow released from his prison in Siberia and took a plane flight to seek political asylum in the United States, but the plane touched down for refueling in Bulgaria, he would have to stay in Bulgaria. He couldn't come to the United States. During the Judiciary Committee's markup, Democrats offered a variety of amendments to exempt the most vulnerable from some of these draconian requirements. This included those fleeing communist and totalitarian regimes and unaccompanied children. But the majority was not even willing to exempt children under a year old. The one place where we were able to make some bipartisan headway was on the issue of E-Verify. E-Verify is an electronic employment eligibility verification system that began as a voluntary pilot program and is currently used by a small percentage of the nation's employers. This bill would make that system mandatory for all employers in the United States. Without providing other reforms, however, including any meaningful opportunity for undocumented workers to regularize their status, this title would damage the U.S. economy, harm American workers, and result in billions of dollars in lost government revenue. In particular, mandatory E-Verify would decimate the agriculture industry, putting U.S. farms out of business, shipping millions of American jobs overseas, and increasing U.S. reliance on imported food. Mandatory E-Verify would result in hundreds of thousands of unfilled farm jobs and would leave unpicked crops rotting in the fields, as we saw in Georgia in 2011, when a mandatory E-Verify law in the state resulted in over 11,000 farm jobs going unfilled during the peak harvest season. Unfortunately, it appears that some of my Republican colleagues with significant agriculture interests in their districts are now willing to support this draconian legislation. Despite sincere concerns about how this provision would affect their constituents, they have caved to Republican leadership with the mere addition of a sense of Congress. That is pathetic. I have only scratched the surface of the many problems contained in this legislation. I have not even mentioned how this bill strips all protections from unaccompanied children and requires all families who come to our border seeking protection to be detained indefinitely, or the extreme lengths to which it goes to narrow the eligibility grounds for asylum, or how this bill would severely restrict this and any future administration's ability to parole individuals into the United States, even going so far as to end the current parole initiatives for Ukrainians fleeing Russia and for certain military families. That means that no Ukrainians fleeing the war in Russia would be allowed into this country. It also means that all Ukrainians here, after a time, would have to return to Ukraine, even if the war is still going on. Mr. Speaker, immigration reform is a complicated problem that requires complicated solutions, and an enforcement-only strategy simply doesn't work. Democrats have put forward real proposals, and we stand ready to work with serious Republicans to pass meaningful solutions. Democrats take this humanitarian crisis seriously. Our proposals address the root causes of migration, improve border security, and create additional legal pathways for people to enter the United States lawfully. But Republicans have chosen a narrow path that imposes extreme pain and hardship on the most vulnerable people while doing nothing to actually solve the problem. I encourage my colleagues to oppose this wrong-headed bill, and I ask the majority to go back to the drawing board. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Lee.
Gentlewoman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 2, the Secure the Border Act, which is the most comprehensive border bill to reach the House floor in modern history. The Biden administration's border policies have led to a national security and humanitarian crisis at our southern border, turning every community into a border community. This administration's failure to secure the border has led to a record amount of illegal drugs both around the border and in our communities, and has enabled human trafficking and the exploitation of children. Recently, law enforcement in my community announced that they had seized enough fentanyl to kill every Floridian. In addition to the drugs flowing into our communities, we've seen a tragic flow of unaccompanied minors across our border, which has led many of them to fall victim to human trafficking, abuse, and mistreatment. A grand jury in Florida recently uncovered alarming details about federal agencies losing track of more than 20,000 children and failing to perform background checks on minor sponsors, again leading to incidents of trafficking, exploitation, and abuse. An open border is not humanitarian. When we fail to control our borders, the drug cartels will. House Republicans know that border security is national security, and that is why we must pass the Secure the Border Act. This legislation will increase the number of Border Patrol agents, strengthen current law to protect unaccompanied children, and bolster our borders infrastructure. We have a constitutional duty to secure our border and to ensure our communities back home are kept safe. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from the state of Texas, Ms. Escobar.
Gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to H.R. 2, a shameful, unserious bill that would shutter our country's asylum system and make the situation at the border much worse. For decades, congressional Republicans have blocked efforts to reform outdated immigration laws, choosing to focus only on the border, believing that if we can be cruel enough, that would deter desperate people from seeking asylum at our nation's front door. That hasn't worked, and H.R. 2 is more of their same failed approach. We all want an orderly, well-managed border, especially those of us who live and raise our families on the border. But there's a critical difference that exists from there. Many of my Republican colleagues want no immigration at all, and many believe cruelty is an effective deterrent. But my Democratic colleagues and I, and indeed most Americans, know that we must and should have legal pathways coupled with enforcement and strategic investment in order to achieve a functional system. This bill is an extremist Republican wish list that caters to the party's most warped values by jailing children and families and extinguishing asylum. The cruelty, unfortunately, is the point. It's no wonder that this bill has been called unchristian. I represent El Paso, Texas. I'm a proud third-generation El Pasoan, and it's where I raised my 2 children. My community has been at the forefront of immigration for decades, and El Pasoans have always stepped up to help migrants. Our local governments and NGOs work alongside U.S. Customs and Border Protection to provide migrants with food, a place to sleep, and assistance finding transportation to their next destination. We collaborate the best we can, united in our shared humanity. In 2019, for the first time, local partners became eligible to receive federal funding for this work, and that's been critical to El Paso and other border communities. H.R. 2 will bring that funding to an end and would make it illegal for NGOs to provide any services, from a bottle of water to a safe place to sleep. Let me remind you of Matthew 35:36, for I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. This bill would decimate the systems that border communities have built and would literally, by design, create humanitarian catastrophe. Because of this and many other shameful provisions, I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to stand against this bill and work with those of us who are committed to a real bipartisan solution. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Moore.
Gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, today I rise to make it clear that Biden's border policies are anything but compassionate. Nearly 300 suspected terrorists have been caught trying to cross our border this year, and those are just the ones we caught. How many actually made it through? As we speak, American border towns are being flooded with unvetted migrants that have nowhere to go. City streets are becoming homeless encampments. Farmland is being trampled. Migrants from over 100 countries, including China, Russia, are paying up to $15,000 apiece to be smuggled across our border by criminal cartel. If they can't pay, migrants are forced to work off their debt. The administration is creating a program of either drug mules or indentured servants. Many of these migrant children brought here by false advertisements of free passage in their countries. The Biden administration has lost 85,000 children. This is unacceptable. These are the things that should keep Americans awake at night. Our border is dangerous not only for the American people whose communities are being pumped full of drugs and crime, but also those seeking to cross it illegally who turn into slaves or drug mules. The numbers are clear. 85,000 children we've lost, 1,000 migrant bodies found along the southern border, 120,000 fentanyl deaths in our country, and the numbers continue to rise. Where is the compassion in that? President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas must answer for the counting fentanyl deaths, the illegal encounters, and the unaccompanied children we've lost. A closed border is a compassionate border, and this week Republicans have brought a real solution to the table by introducing H.R. 2. I urge all my colleagues to vote in favor of this bill. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from California, Ms. Lofgren.
Gentlelady from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, there's lots wrong with this bill. It's been mentioned by others, turning away children back to their smugglers at the border and the like. But I want to focus on the issue of those fleeing communist oppression. For years, we had bipartisan agreement. We welcome those who flee communist oppression. Today is Vietnam Human Rights Day, and it reminds us that we welcomed 1 million refugees fleeing communism in Vietnam. We welcomed Cubans fleeing Fidel Castro. We welcomed Nicaraguans and Venezuelans who fled communist oppression. This bill would upend that tradition. It would turn away people who are fleeing oppression from communist and totalitarian persecution. Now, there was a time when both of us, on both sides of the aisle, opposed communism and welcomed people who were fleeing communist oppression. What happened to you? I stand on the side of political dissidents who believe in freedom and who are fleeing communist oppression. There's one more thing. This bill would cripple American agriculture. I realize there was a fig leaf added about an assessment on ag. We all know that will not work. The Bipartisan Farm Workforce Modernization Act, which this House passed twice, had E-Verify in the bill, but only with the reforms for ag. I believe our laws ought to be enforced, but we need laws that can work. And that's what our bipartisan farm workforce bill did. This bill doesn't do that. An estimated half of farm workers in America are undocumented. Kick them out of the fields, and farmers are going to hurt big time. The cost of food will skyrocket. This is a very poor idea. I'll just say this. All of us, want to have an orderly system. The disorder is obvious at the border, but this bill won't fix that. It's mean, but it won't fix it. We have a variety of proposals to reform the immigration laws. We're still working on the outline from the 1965 Act. Small wonder it doesn't work very well for America in 2023. I would urge a no vote on this bill, and I would urge all of my colleagues to work with us together to craft measures in immigration and immigration enforcement that will actually work for the United States. This bill doesn't do that, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the sponsor of H.R. 2, Mr. Diaz-Balart of Florida.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In just a few hours, the Biden administration will end the enforcement of Title 42. This administration estimates that we could see 13,000 immigrant encounters per day at the border. So clearly allowing 42 to end with no plan to secure our border is not only negligent, but it severely jeopardizes the national security interests of our country. But you see, the cataclysm facing our border is not just due to the end of Title 42, Mr. Speaker, but also to this administration's complete abdication to do even the bare minimum to secure our southern border. And it is negligence and incompetence, Mr. Speaker, with fatal consequences. Instead, the administration has relinquished control to the narco-terrorist cartels who now control the southern border of the United States. The Biden administration's policies are dangerous to our national security, Mr. Speaker, but they have deadly consequences for Americans and for immigrants alike. Heck, even the New York Times has highlighted the fact that 90,000 unaccompanied minors are unaccounted for and, frankly, are possibly being trafficked. It is immoral, Mr. Speaker, that the Biden administration refuses to take action to end human trafficking, stop the deadly influx of drugs into the United States, confront the cartels, protect those minors that are being trafficked, and enhance our outdated asylum process. And those, by the way, who have legitimate claims, those folks are also victims of this broken system. However, today, this House has a solution to help take back control of our border. H.R. 2, the Secure the Border Act, which I'm so proud to have sponsored with my colleague and friend, Mr. McClintock, provides real solutions to restore order to the southern border, strengthen our national security, enhance our broken immigration system, and protect innocent minors while enforcing the rule of law. The rule of law, Mr. Speaker. So if you're concerned about our national security or the safety of our fellow Americans and immigrants, the safety of our immigrants, or the rule of law, I respectfully but frankly strongly urge you to vote for this great bill, H.R. 2. I yield back.
Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Ivey.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I would like to support legislation that fairly and appropriately addresses the serious shortcomings in our country's immigration laws. But unfortunately, H.R. 2 is not that bill. H.R. 2 is a false promise to the extreme Republican base. The Senate has already made it clear that this bill is dead on arrival. But even if the bill somehow passed, it does not provide funding to build a wall, nor hire more Border Patrol officers, nor retain those we already have. A cornerstone of H.R. 2 and its first major provision is a return to Donald Trump's quest to build a wall along our southern border. But the Republican bill doesn't even provide the money to pay for it. The bill calls for a wall that is at least 900 miles long, but it would not stop the flow of fentanyl. The Sinaloa cartel in Mexico routinely drives by the wall that's already there, flies over the wall, and tunnels underneath it, as we learned during the DOJ takedown of the Sinaloa cartel a few weeks ago. The wall would also be a financial disaster. H.R. 2 presumes that the wall would be funded with unspent money that has been allocated for the wall, but former President Trump siphoned away much of the unspent funds for the wall from other departments, and the programs for those funds were eventually regained their funding. According to the CBO's analysis, another 160 miles of the wall would have to be built to reach the 900-mile mandate that is in the bill. In estimating these costs, CBO wrote, CBO estimates an average cost per mile of $25 million. CBO expects that previously appropriated amounts would cover the cost of 80 miles of construction. Thus, CBP would estimate an additional $2 billion to complete the other 80 miles. And on top of that, the Republicans just announced that they proposed a 22% cut across the board for much of the government, including DHS. In March, I joined my colleagues on a visit to the southern border. We met with Customs and Border Patrol officers. The border officers were unanimous in the need for more resources, more agents, and more technology. We took their comments to heart. During the markup, Democrats sought to provide more immigration judges, more processing centers that combined federal, state, and local resources, but those amendments were also voted down by Republicans. Democrats also sought to ensure that Border Patrol officers were paid according to the established civil pay scale, expand technology to X-ray trucks at the border, where over 90% of the fentanyl enters the United States, boost the quantity and quality of drones used by our officers to cut the cartel's 17-to-1 advantage in drones they now use to traffic drugs and other contraband, add 1,700 Border Patrol officers to manage the border and intercept the flow of illegal drugs such as fentanyl. But all of these amendments were rejected by our Republican colleagues. Worse still, the Republican bill prohibits NGOs like the Red Cross and Salvation Army from providing essential goods and services to migrants who desperately need them. This is why many groups have written letters of opposition to H.R. 2, including the U.S. Conference of Bishops.
I yield the gentleman an additional minute.
Gentleman's recognized for an additional minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Mr. Ranking Member. This is why many groups have written letters of opposition to H.R. 2, including the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, the AFL-CIO, Catholic Charities, and 136 humanitarian aid organizations that signed a joint letter of opposition. For example, the Bishop of El Paso and the chairman of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee on Migration wrote, "As drafted, these provisions could be interpreted to prevent schools, houses of worship, and other organizations from qualifying for the Nonprofit Security Grant Program amid a rise in violent attacks on those places." The bishop also noted that DHS's ability to rescue persons encountered in the desert and life-threatening circumstances and process unaccompanied children, victims of trafficking, victims of torture, and others who even under this bill's terms would warrant such processing could be precluded. Mr. Speaker, for these and many other reasons, I thoroughly oppose H.R. 2. The bill certainly does not offer anything that even hints...
Gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman's time's expired.
I strongly oppose the legislation. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the delegate from Guam, Mr. Moylan.
Gentleman from Guam is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 2 because protecting America's borders also means protecting my community. Guam is geographically closer to China than any other part of the United States. And for that reason, I view border security as an important piece of national security. While securing the border, H.R. 2 also makes it easier for employers to hire H-2A workers. And I support these efforts because the similar H-2B visa program is an irreplaceable source of labor for the Department of Defense and is absolutely necessary to supplement Guam's construction labor force, which ultimately serves the purpose of protecting our nation. I thank my colleagues for their work on H.R. 2. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman from California reserved. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Garcia.
Gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to H.R. 2, the Secure the Border Act of 2023, scheduled for vote on the House floor later today. This legislation is harmful, dangerous, irresponsible, and just plain wrong. Instead of securing the border, this bill will separate families, put human lives at risk, lead to more unlawful migration by blocking off lawful pathways to protection, and waste taxpayer dollars on an ineffective wall that can't even withstand wind, much less criminal smuggling cartels. Instead of treating this like the emergency that it is, House Republicans focus on immigration slowly at the border, providing billions of dollars in so-called border security, building walls, increasing personnel, and rapid expulsion policies. Since 1998, at least 8,000 undocumented migrants have died attempting to cross the border from Mexico and the U.S. People are dying. They're dying every day. Children are exploited. They're exploited every day. Families are being separated. They're being separated every day. We have all been waiting for many years, 27 years in fact, since the last meaningful legislation of immigration reform passed by this body. But since then, Republicans have rejected every bill that's been proposed. This bill, again, is wrong. It's not a solution. It is a slap in the face to our immigration system. There is no time left, Mr. Speaker. This bill is extreme, it's wrong, and what we really need is safe immigration law now. I urge a no vote on this bill. And Mr. Speaker, I also ask unanimous consent to add the text of this amendment to the record immediately prior to the vote on the motion to recommit.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to yield 3 minutes to Mr. Moran of Texas, the author of one of the measures in the bill.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, let me thank Judiciary Chairman Mr. Jim Jordan of Ohio, my colleagues Mr. Diaz-Balart of Florida, Mr. McClintock of California, and Mr. Green of Tennessee for working so diligently on this comprehensive border security package, one that will work to physically secure our borders, protect the sovereignty of our nation, protect the lives, livelihoods, and property of our current American citizens and those that are here legally, and give hope to those from outside our country who seek to find a better life here by restoring surety and sanity to the immigration process. The ability of our nation to continue to be the world's haven and leader in both liberty and generosity is directly related to our ability to first preserve the rule of law here, protect the sanctity of America's geographic boundaries, and preserve the greatness of our nation from within. Earlier this year, in a hearing in the House Judiciary Committee, the El Paso County judge said explicitly and without reservation that there was, quote, no crisis at the southern border. But the facts, the pictures, the videos, and the personal testimonies of those on the border tell a different story. Ironically, just last week, the mayor of the city of El Paso declared a state of emergency for the city because of this very border crisis. For 2 years now, Secretary Mayorkas has told the American people that the Department of Homeland Security has, quote, operational control on the southern border. But we know better. Despite the administration sending 1,500 U.S. troops to the border just in the past couple weeks, these actions are too little, too late. More correctly, they are illusory in nature. Though we do need additional personnel on the border, what we really need is an administration with the resolve to simply enforce the rule of law and put American families ahead of politics. For too long, this administration has turned a blind eye to the crisis at the southern border. They have not enforced the policies and laws currently in place, and as a result, we've seen an influx of migrants crossing our border and illegally entering the United States over the last 2 years. These 11th hour measures taken by the Secretary of Homeland Security will sadly have a little to no effect on stopping this historic surge because there is no will, no resolve, and no determination by the administration to stop this invasion. That is why the House Republicans today are going to take decisive and historic action to do just as the American people need, and that is to secure our border. In East Texas, we see the direct and dire consequences of non-existent immigration policies, and many more outside Texas in the past couple of years are beginning to see this as well. Now is the time to take action. Now is the time to act with courage and boldness. Now is the time to pass H.R. 2, the Secure the Borders Act of 2023. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Correa.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank our colleagues from the side of the aisle for taking on such an important and difficult task: immigration reform, the refugee crisis. And my friends on the other side are absolutely correct. Title 42 is ending today. But I have to remind you, when many of you voted to lift the COVID-19 emergency, you legally, effectively voted to end Title 42. Don't forget that. You voted to lift Title 42. Today, we are facing a worldwide refugee crisis, the likes that we haven't seen since World War II. And in World War II, we had 60 million refugees moving throughout Europe. This is what we're facing today. It's not only the United States, Mexico, Guatemala, Colombia, who's housing 2.4 million Venezuelan refugees. This is a challenge for all of us. We need real solutions. And under existing laws, we do have some solutions. I'm probably the only legislator here today that went to visit the Ukrainian refugee camps in Tijuana, Mexico, about a year ago. Let me tell you what I found. Ukrainian refugees in Tijuana waiting to cross into the United States. What did we do? We lifted Title 42. We gave them temporary protective status, walked them into the United States. Today, that refugee camp is gone. Why? Because those refugees can apply for status from Europe directly. That's a model that worked under existing laws. And the administration, this Biden administration, is implementing something very similar to that as we speak. Your proposal, my good friends on the other side of the aisle, has some challenges. I want to start by talking with the biggest one, E-Verify, mandatory E-Verify. We have a labor shortage in this country. Every time I get the small businessmen here, large businessmen, the farmers especially, 50% of our farm workers are undocumented today in this country. They're the ones who pick our crops. Forced E-Verify, you're essentially making small business owners criminals. They're going to have to choose between firing those employees, harvesting their crops, or becoming criminals. That's not the intent of your legislation, but that is effectively what you are doing today. And my colleague from California knows that because that's why he pushed an amendment for the farming industry, for this exact reason. But we not only have farmers, we have small businesses as well in this country. I would say E-Verify without true immigration reform is not going to work. My friends, I reach out to you across the aisle and say, let's do this for America. Let's fix our broken immigration system, and let's address this worldwide refugee challenge right now. Mr. Speaker, I yield. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from New York reserves. And members are reminded to address their remarks to the chair. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Siscomani.
Gentleman is recognized.
I rise today as a proud product of the American dream. I became a U.S. citizen in 2006, and today, 17 years later, I stand here as a member of the United States Congress. I also stand here as a representative of southeastern Arizona. What's happening at the border is not part of the American dream my family pursued and thousands of other families continue to pursue. We've seen babies abandoned in rivers, migrants dying in deserts, high-speed car chases through neighborhoods, and 85,000 children disappear after being released from HHS custody. We have a border crisis, a humanitarian crisis, and on the front lines of our border communities, Americans have been failed by the government designed to protect them. While our country suffers because of this administration's inaction, House Republicans have proposed a solution. H.R. 2 gives our agents and officers the resources they desperately need, closes loopholes in an abused asylum system, and protects innocent children from harm. This bill is a step away from the chaos we are seeing and a step closer to helping others achieve the American dream I've been so blessed to live. Mr. Speaker, with that, I yield back.
Gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Let me thank the gentleman and ask that I have the ability to submit my statement into the record, unanimous consent. It is important to really take a look at what we're doing here today. And it is very obvious that we are addressing this question from the perspective of punishing families and punishing our children. Yes, the children. The children are of all of us, because we know that no matter what country you're in, the children are our future. And so this legislation that is supposed to be a border security bill done without bipartisanship and extensively rejecting thoughtful amendments given by the members of the Judiciary Committee and Homeland Security. And so in Houston, this is to create an added nightmare in order not to be able to help those who are in need. Because they are coming, because in fact, there are processes where they are able to access the process of asylum. The fear that is made and given to the American people is to create hysteria rather than reason. I don't know what happened to the very reasonable comprehensive immigration reform led by the late John McCain. Republicans dished it, leaving DACA recipients, people who are EMS and doctors and lawyers, still in limbo. So here we come again with this bill that is the child deportation bill. And it says in Houston to Catholic Charities or the National Association of Christian Churches that is helping in New York that you will be made criminals because we will not allow you to help those who are coming forward who have status with paperwork for an asylum, but yet they are still unstatus, undocumented. It makes it absolutely impossible to come to the border to seek asylum. It upends the process and protections in place for unaccompanied children and requires all migrants seeking admission without a visa either to be detained or subjected to a program that Trump had. And we know if we have someone who is going to, in essence, pardon all of the January 6 persons, that is not a reliable policy. It is clear that mandating indefinite detention for all asylum-seeking families and children is a deportation bill for children. Allowing children to be detained in the Border Patrol facilities for an entire month is a cruel and inhumane act. Hold a 9-month-old baby in your arms who was separated from their family. And maybe then, as I did, almost 6 years, almost more than 6 years, almost 10 years ago, this has been ongoing through all administrations. And the only reason that the past administration had a Title 42 is because of the pandemic. We need not to have that patchwork of disaster. We need to be able to ensure that we are working studiously to ensure. Let me share with you these numbers, because people are in fact alarmed, and they need to know that the migrants coming in are from Mexico. We do have an OTM other than Mexican people already going back. India, China, the Philippines, East Salvador, Vietnam, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, and Korea. So it is a widely diverse based upon the persecution that people are feeling or the economic lack of life. I would only say that as we proceeded to do this work, do you know, as I leave this podium, that if you're an overstay in a hospital, you can automatically be criminally charged? And an amendment that I said, what is the intent? Do you know whether they were in the hospital? They had a funeral. They were, in essence, near death. No mercy. This legislation needs to go back to the drawing boards, and Americans and Houstonians are asking for us to do the right thing and to get security at the border and not have a bill that does nothing. That's what it does, absolutely nothing. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, it's my privilege to yield 3 minutes to the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Mr. Jordan of Ohio.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, since Joe Biden took office, 5 million illegal border crossers encountered, 2 million illegal aliens released into the country, another 2 million, over 370,000 unaccompanied alien children have been encountered on the border, and the Biden administration has lost track of 85,000 kids. 85,000 of that number, and nearly 200 on the terrorist watch list have been encountered on our border. And at midnight tonight, it gets worse. It gets worse tonight. And here's the kicker. Here's the kicker. It's all been done intentionally. Day one, January 20th, 2021, Joe Biden said, no more wall, no more remain in Mexico. You get to the border, you get released into the country. Well, Shazam, everyone's going to come. And that's exactly what's happened. They're all coming, and tonight it gets worse. And it was done in premeditated fashion, deliberate fashion, purposeful. It was all done intentionally, which is I cannot figure out why they would do this. And who seized on this? The cartels. They're making tons of money, exploiting people, exploiting kids. It's terrible. This bill, strongest immigration enforcement legislation in modern times, does all kinds of good things on E-Verify, visa overstay, parole authority, the Flores decision, unaccompanied alien children, the asylum reforms. But the best part of this bill, the key component of this bill, is where we say, if you come to our country, you will get to, according to the law, file your asylum claim. We're going to follow the law. But you will be detained or you will be returned while your claim is adjudicated. We change the incentive. If you don't do that, you never solve this problem. That's what this legislation does. And I want to thank the leadership of our conference, the speaker, the leader, the whip, the conference chair. I want to thank the staff. Andrea Loving and her staff did an amazing job. I want to thank Mr. Biggs, Mr. Bentz, Mr. Roy, Mr. Tiffany, Mr. Calvert, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Carter, Moran, and Chairman Green, and Mr. Diaz-Balart, who sponsored the legislation. But the guy who deserves the most thanks is the chairman of the subcommittee on immigration. Without his work, without his effort, and how he stuck to this issue and got it done, this doesn't happen. This is a good day for the country. Let's hope the Senate will take up this bill after we pass it, because this is the only thing that will help stop the craziness that now for 28 months has been going on our southern border. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Speaker, when I hear the rhetoric on the other side, it's one of the very few times I say to myself, thank God for the existence of the United States Senate. Mr. Speaker, I now yield 5 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 2, the Secure the Border Act. From day one, Republicans made clear that they would pursue an unworkable enforcement-only approach. I was encouraged when I saw some of my Republican colleagues courageously standing up to their caucus to fight to protect access to asylum. And yet here we are today debating a cruel and extreme and an unworkable bill that guts asylum for everyone who does not live in a neighboring country or cannot afford to fly directly to the United States to seek protection. A bill that bars anyone who seeks protection by entering the country between ports of entry from ever being able to obtain asylum, even if they are an unaccompanied child or fleeing from a totalitarian dictatorship. A bill that decimates Customs and Border Protection's ability to process people for asylum at ports of entry. A bill that mandates indefinite family detention and the detention of children. One Republican colleague told us that, quote, trying to ban legitimate asylum claims is very anti-American. His words, not mine. Another Republican said it will never pass the Senate if we're only talking border security. Yet another Republican cautioned against only moving border security legislation, saying it's immoral and it's wrong that we as a society allow for millions and millions of people to live in the shadows. I was encouraged by those comments, Mr. Speaker, because it showed me that there were people on the other side who understood at least at some level that what happens at the border is simply a symptom of an immigration system that desperately needs to be modernized to meet the needs of our economy and our family. I thought that perhaps we would be able to work together in a bipartisan way on those pieces instead of trying the same 30-year-old failed strategy of cruel enforcement-only methods that continue to destroy legal pathways and violate our values. We all know those simply don't work. Unfortunately, it sounds like the Speaker has tempted those individuals who were talking with their values to now vote yes with a few meaningless concessions and promises. Their constituents will still know exactly what they're doing when they vote yes on this bill. The bill before us today has only gotten more extreme from when those initial comments were made. It still ends asylum. It still strips protections for unaccompanied children. It still mandates the detention of families and children, and it will still wreck our economy. What Democrats are committed to, what our families and our country need, is to have an updated, orderly process for people to come to America, to stay, to work here, to be with their families and their loved ones, to have the ability to travel back and forth, to be seen in a country that too often uses immigrants without giving them full dignity and respect. The immigration system is made up of many different legal pathways. Whether you're a refugee fleeing war and economic devastation, or an asylee that's fleeing persecution, or a worker who's seeking to come here and work in the many fields that demand immigrant labor and skills, from agriculture to healthcare, whether you're a child or a parent or a sibling who seeks to be reunited with your immediate family, whether you're somebody who wants to start a small business or lead a major company. Unfortunately, the previous administration stripped so many of those pathways, decimated the funding to process those who seek to come in, and did nothing for those who have been here, often for 15 years or more. That is why Democrats have put forward real, bipartisan solutions to humanely fix and modernize the immigration system, including the recently introduced comprehensive bill by Linda Sanchez to reform our immigration system in a humane way. Immigration has been the unique genius of America's history, necessary to our economic vitality, necessary to the success of the country. We know what we need to do to fix the system, Mr. Speaker. That's not a question in terms of policy. In fact, just 10 years ago, a bipartisan comprehensive immigration bill passed the U.S. Senate with 68 bipartisan votes, only to come to this floor, the floor of the House, where the Republican majority refused to bring it to a vote. Why? Why, Mr. Speaker, did it not come to a vote in the House with that huge of a bipartisan majority in the Senate? Because Republicans in the House knew that it would pass in a bipartisan way, and somehow my friends on the other side think that it benefits them to have an immigration system that is broken so they can continue to vilify and demonize immigrants who are here and stop them from doing the work they need to do and being respected. We need to call this hypocrisy out over and over again.
Mr. Speaker, I yield the gentlelady an additional minute.
The American people support immigration, and we are ready. We are ready, Mr. Speaker, to work with serious Republicans to pass meaningful reforms. Not an enforcement-only strategy that will continue to be a failed strategy no matter who's in the White House, but actually a strategy that allows people to come to this country, that upholds our values, that is not un-American, but is the very essence of what America stands for so many people around the United States, including me, somebody who came here at 16 years old by myself to this country, and now, after so many years of fighting for this country, I'm able to be here as a United States Congress member. Those are the values that we need to remember. Vote no on this extreme, unworkable, cruel bill. It is a patchwork of overlapping and contradictory bills that are just about enforcement only, not about real solutions. It is clear that my friends on the other side do not have real solutions to this issue and just want to keep this out there so we can continue to demonize immigrants. Democrats will not stand for it. Vote no.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Nails.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let's be clear. We are here today because Joe Biden opened his mouth. When Joe Biden took office, he had to do nothing. He had to do nothing to secure our southern border. All he had to do was keep President Trump's policies in place. Instead, he halted the construction of the Trump border wall, left over 150 miles of planned border wall unbuilt. And as I stand here today, materials are lying at our border, lying on the ground, they're rusting in the sun as hundreds of thousands of illegal aliens wait to flood into our country. And to date, folks, over 5 million illegal aliens have invaded our border, and an additional 1.5 million of them, the bad hombres, have evaded capture since Joe Biden took over. This historic legislation restores Trump-era immigration policies that prioritize the safety of the American people, takes away the incentives that the Biden administration created to encourage illegal aliens to enter our country, and defends our brave Border Patrol agents, and of course reforms the asylum process. H.R. 2 criminalizes those who overstay their visas, stops the abuse of parole authority to bypass immigration law, and helps employers to ensure that the workers they are hiring are legal and authorized to work in the United States. It is past time we restore law and order at our southern border. We cannot continue to allow illegal aliens to infiltrate our country, kill American citizens, rob hardworking Americans of health care and other services, increase housing costs, crowd our nation's public schools, and create a country filled with chaos. And you think the homeless problem is bad now? Just wait. The Biden administration has failed to prioritize the safety of our country, our families, our livelihoods, and our children's future. House Republicans are committed to securing the border and ending the national security crisis that the Joe Biden administration has created and ignored. I encourage my colleagues to vote yes on this legislation, and let's take back control of our southern border and restore the rule of law. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. You know, rain can be a blessing or a curse, depending on whether we get too much or too little. And like water, America can be sustained, our prosperity and our strength, by the flow of people who want to come here if they can come here legally. What Republicans rave about as a crisis, if properly addressed, represents a great opportunity for our country. By overcoming Republican opposition last year, we have achieved the lowest unemployment in America in 50 years. If every single American who is reported as unemployed today were to take a job, we would still have millions of unfilled jobs in this country. Our economy is crying out, help wanted, to which Republicans respond, keep out. Build a wall to wall us off from the rest of the world. Well, we have a serious worker shortage. Our economic growth today is being slowed because so many businesses cannot find the workers they need to fulfill the needs of their customers. Yet just across our border are a host of people who are looking for a job. We need construction workers. We need workers to care for the old and the ill and the young, restaurant and other service jobs. Some of them are very highly skilled, and some of them are hardly skilled. If some immigrants could work in this country and come here legally and go home when they need to, they wouldn't be risking their lives in deserts, dying in dangerous rivers, and sitting on the streets of our border communities. Certainly, we cannot take everyone who wants to come here. We need rules for orderly immigration, for fairness. They're the rules that Republicans have blocked in this Congress for years. So long as they see anti-immigrant hysteria as more valuable to them politically than finding a solution, we're not going to get there. Today's vote represents just their latest refusal to accept reality. Another refusal to enact a comprehensive and reasonable system for legal entry for workers. And there is, of course, a humanitarian aspect. Our dreamers, brought here as little children, now many adults, facing years of uncertainty. A nurse, a Travis County prosecutor, a teacher, many students that I have met personally who still don't know how long they can tell their employer they can work. So much they have to contribute. Multiple studies showing they will only strengthen our economy. And there are other families in Texas border towns today who have risked everything to escape oppression, corrupt and authoritarian governments like Venezuela. Many of them have legitimate claims for political asylum, but the Republicans have abandoned the promise of our Statue of Liberty. Another 15 seconds.
I grant the gentleman another 30 seconds.
America's strength has always been found in our diversity. Let's overcome the fear-mongering, the anti-immigrant hysteria, and do the serious, hard work of passing genuine, comprehensive immigration reform. Let's turn immigration into a true win for the American people. I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to my colleague and neighbor from California, Mr. Kiley.
The gentleman is recognized.
Secure the border. Mr. Speaker, this isn't something we should have to insist upon. It shouldn't be controversial. It shouldn't be a source of partisan contention. It is a basic, foundational responsibility of government, and one that is currently being neglected like never before, with devastating consequences all across our country. Perhaps the worst of those consequences is the fentanyl crisis. We are seeing staggering amounts of fentanyl pour across the southern border, flooding our communities with illicit and lethal pills, killing tens of thousands of Americans every year. We know exactly where these drugs are coming from. The Biden administration's own drug enforcement agency admits that Mexican-based cartels are responsible for the vast majority of fentanyl and meth that is killing Americans. Just over the past year alone, the DEA seized 193 million deadly doses of fentanyl. This is now the leading cause of death for young people in our country, more than car accidents, more than suicides, more than anything. It is affecting every community in our country, including my own. During the State of the Union, I was honored to have as my guests 2 of the nation's leading advocates for fentanyl awareness, and those are the parents of a young man named Zach Didier, who tragically lost his life. He was a senior at Whitney High School, a standout student, and from one pill, with no history of drug use, tragically lost his life. His parents then had to go through the gut-wrenching experience of seeing him get letters in the mail accepting him to some of our nation's leading universities after he had passed away. There simply can be no doubt, it is beyond doubt, that the current failure to secure our border is resulting in tragic and avoidable loss of life every day. Today, we have a chance to do something about it by passing H.R. 2. This is one of the most important bills that will be considered in the 118th Congress. It's one of the most important pieces of legislation that we will ever vote upon.
Gentleman's time
it is
is
a
expired.
comprehensive border security package, and I urge an aye vote.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 2, this harmful partisan Republican legislation, for many reasons, but especially because it will endanger people seeking asylum. This bill takes us backward after years of acknowledging the need for comprehensive immigration reform. The expansion of family detention in this bill will hurt children and families. It's costly, and it does not work as the majority claims. Mental health and medical experts agree. Jailing immigrant families exposes children to high levels of trauma and distress. We should be expanding effective programs like family case management. But this bill guts the program, will undermine its proven record of close to 90% compliance. We live in a country of immigrants, and our nation is stronger because of its diversity. I urge all of my colleagues to oppose building walls and detention centers and support comprehensive, humane immigration reform that will strengthen our economy, enhance our security, and reflect our core values as Americans. And Mr. Speaker, I request unanimous consent to enter into the record an article from Social Security and Medicine about the high levels of mental health distress experienced by children who are held in immigration detention. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Without objection. Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Wyoming, Ms. Hagman.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we have a crisis at our southern border. It is a crisis that started in earnest on the day this president was sworn into office. On day one of his presidency, he began issuing executive orders to end the successful policies implemented by the Trump administration. In total, President Biden issued 94 executive orders related to the border within his first 100 days in office, and the results have been disastrous. Over 10 times the population of my home state of Wyoming has illegally crossed the border since Joe Biden has been president. At the same time, over 14,000 pounds of fentanyl have come across the southwest border, enough to kill over 3.1 billion people. Through the first 6 months of 2023, 80 people who appeared on the terror watch list have been caught trying to cross into the United States, more than the last 5 years combined. How many slipped through? We don't know. These numbers show that without a doubt, Joe Biden has enabled the largest drug smuggling and human trafficking operation in U.S. history, and he has made our country less safe in the process. Stopping illegal immigration is the #1 issue for my constituents in Wyoming. We must fix this situation, and H.R. 2 does just that. It is time to finish the wall, end catch and release, protect women and children from human traffickers, stop the illegal drugs flowing into the country, fix our broken asylum process, and force this administration to finally address the disaster that they have created. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have left?
The gentleman has 25¼ minutes remaining.
25 1/4.
25.25.
0.25
minutes.
I thank the Speaker.
Not seconds.
I thank the Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Texas, Mr. Kassar.
The gentleman is recognized.
I'm the son of immigrants and proud to represent the heart of Texas here in the United States Congress. For generations, my family has moved back and forth between Texas and Mexico, Mexico and Texas. People immigrate, sometimes in search of safety, sometimes for economic opportunity, but always for family and a better life. What folks aren't immigrating for is to bring fentanyl into the country, as folks on the other side of the aisle have been talking about time after time after time. In committee, it was laid out very clearly that over 90% of folks arrested for fentanyl trafficking are U.S. citizens and lawful residents. That's why this Republican anti-immigrant bill, H.R. 2, is cruel, extreme, and not based on fact. It would destroy the asylum system, cage children and families indefinitely, and make the situation at our border worse. In fact, this bill would eliminate funding for much of the remaining legal immigration system that we have, leading to chaos. But chaos, unfortunately, is what top Republican officials want. They want the immigration system to stay broken so that they can blame Democrats for it. This is a case of arsonists blaming the firefighters for the flames. For example, Congressman Castro and I worked with the Biden administration to expedite funding to Texas this month to ensure that migrants can sleep in a safe shelter while they process their immigration case instead of being in a tent on the border. In stark contrast, this Republican bill in front of us today would ban these sorts of shelters and services. Migrants sleeping on the streets of Texas may be a better shot for Fox News cameras, but it's a much worse deal for everyday people. In Texas, we are still mourning those killed by a mass shooter in Allen. We're seeking justice for the kids and the teachers killed in Uvalde. We haven't fixed our electric grid, and people are struggling to pay the rent and the mortgage. We need help from this Congress, but instead we get hate for immigrants. We should be creating an economy that works for everyone, immigrant and native-born. We should be expanding our freedoms, not ripping away people's rights. Let's welcome asylum seekers fleeing violence and catastrophe with a safe and orderly system. Let's create pathways for legal immigration rather than the broken system today that forces people to go around the rules. Let's work towards a safer and more just and more prosperous Western Hemisphere so that we reduce those factors that are pushing mass migration. Let's look at the role of U.S. sanctions that starve people abroad instead of feeding them. Let's recognize that immigrants are a key part of our past and our present in this country. Many of our joint faith traditions call for us to care for our neighbors, near and far. I remember when my priest told me the story of how the Holy Family was prosecuted by King Herod, and how Jesus, Mary, and Joseph had to flee across the border into Egypt, across a big river. The priest said he forgets whether the river was called the Nile or the Rio Grande, but it's besides the point. Today, our story is no different. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time we have remaining?
The gentleman from California has 36 minutes remaining.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I'm now pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany, the author of one of the measures in this package.
The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this legislation, which is long overdue. For the last 2 years, this administration has systematically and deliberately erased our border. They have unleashed a tidal wave of illegal aliens and deadly drugs into our communities. They have enriched the cartels and human traffickers. They have disrespected the millions of legal immigrants who followed our laws and came here the right way. They have pushed our local hospitals and schools to the breaking point and forced you, the American people, to pick up the tab. Mr. Speaker, that ends today. This bill would restart border wall construction. It would add more Border Patrol agents. It would crack down on people gaming our asylum laws. And it would end the failed policy of catch and release. I'm also pleased that this legislation includes a measure I authored to end the administrative flagrant abuse of parole. As everyone in this chamber knows, parole authority is limited. It allows for the admission of foreigners without a visa under very narrow circumstances for urgent humanitarian reasons on an individual case-by-case basis. It was intended to accommodate, for example, a young child seeking immediate, life-saving medical treatment that is only available here in the United States. But that's not how President Biden has used it. Instead, he has converted this narrow avenue into an open borders superhighway, indiscriminately admitting more than 1 million illegal immigrants over just the last 2 years. This is not just wrong, it is reckless. It's time to restore the rule of law, and it's time to restrain the dangerous impulses of this administration. Mr. Speaker, Americans are tired of the chaos. They deserve an immigration system that puts the safety and well-being of Americans first, and that's exactly what this bill does. I ask for a yes vote on the bill. And I would just like to close by thanking the gentleman from California who did such a stellar job of shepherding this bill through the Judiciary Committee and now on to the House floor. I yield back.
The gentleman from California yields. The gentleman from New York. The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from California, Ms. Chu.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 2, the Child Deportation Act. This bill is not a serious attempt to fix our broken immigration system and address the humanitarian crisis at our southern border. Rather, H.R. 2 is an anti-immigrant mega wish list. It would put kids in cages and allow them to be held in Border Patrol facilities for up to 30 days, 10 times longer than current law. It would place unaccompanied children at risk of human trafficking, sexual exploitation, and violence. It would bar non-governmental organizations like the Red Cross and Catholic Charities from working with our government to shelter immigrants, creating dangerous and inhumane conditions for our border communities. It would decimate our asylum system by creating new and arbitrary restrictions for asylum seekers, all while gutting programs such as humanitarian parole that have been proven to reduce the number of arrivals at our border. It would exacerbate the crisis by tearing down our humanitarian assistance programs while reassigning border agents away from stopping the transport of illegal drugs like fentanyl. H.R. 2 will cause irreparable harm to children and families, undermine our international leadership, and hurt our economy. Yesterday, House Democrats presented a serious framework for how to fix and modernize our immigration system. The U.S. Citizenship Act, or USCA, recognizes that a robust, humane, and efficient immigration system makes America stronger. It would actually alleviate the humanitarian crisis at the southern border by helping the president address the root causes of migration and providing resources to humanely and efficiently process children and families who seek asylum here. And it would reunite families, fix our visa backlog, protect immigrant workers from unscrupulous employers, and ensure no future president can ban entire groups based on religion. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this bill.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Johnson, the author of one of the other measures in this package.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman from California. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's been so much misinformation here on the floor today. I think we've got to set the facts straight here. Look, it's clear that providing refuge for individuals fleeing persecution has been a central tenet of U.S. immigration law for decades. The asylum process itself is a testament to America's history as a beacon of hope, freedom, and opportunity for millions around the world. But here's the deal. Unfortunately, drug cartels and activist judges and human smuggling operations and the open borders lobby and the radical liberal administrations have worked in tandem to undermine that system, to undermine the integrity of the U.S. immigration system itself. And in the process, they've weakened protections for those who are truly seeking a safe haven from persecution by forcing them into a years-long line in immigration court. Look, we all agree that the current asylum system is in desperate need of repair, and the Secure the Border Act provides the necessary tools to fix it. We're hearing all kinds of fear-mongering today from the other side. It's not a surprise. They have hand-wringing and name-calling, and we hear these accusations that Republicans are anti-immigrant and inhumane, and we hear grandiose pronouncements that the Democrats are pro-immigrant and pro-humanitarian values. But all of this is to distract the American people, to try their best to distract them from what they're seeing with their own eyes. The chaos at the border is intentional. It is designed by this administration and Mayorkas and Biden himself. To my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I ask you, what is humane about a human smuggler abandoning a 1-year-old child in a diaper at the U.S.-Mexico border? What pro-immigrant policy is pursued with aliens suffocating to death in tractor trailers and freight train cars? What are the humanitarian principles behind policies that encourage child trafficking, sexual exploitation, and violence directed towards some of society's most vulnerable people? If you're going to be pro-immigrant and support humanitarian values, you have to fix these problems, and that's what we're trying to do here today. Being pro-immigrant and supporting humanitarian values does not mean maintaining the disastrous status quo, because all that's going to do is give us more death, more exploitation, more real, tangible harm to aliens and citizens alike. We live in the greatest country in the history of the world. It's not even close. We're the most benevolent people in the history of the world. We have a rich history of our asylum program, protecting people who need it, but we have to fix this. These frivolous asylum claims are creating backlogs in the court. I drafted the Asylum Reform and Border Protection Act. It's a big chunk of this immigration package today. We're trying to fix this so that we can do our duty as the humanitarian people that we are. Our bill necessarily codifies key terms, it makes uniform interpretations regardless of geography, and it reserves asylum for the people who truly need it. Our bill will get prevent this flood of frivolous asylum applications that are running rampant and close the loopholes. I encourage my colleagues to support the Secure the Border Act. Our country's stability, sovereignty, and security depends upon this. The stakes could not be any higher. I thank the gentleman again, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from California reserves, and the members are invited to address their remarks to the chair. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from New York, Ms. Velasquez.
Mr. Speaker,
The gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition of this cruel, extreme, and unworkable policy. The United States has long been a beacon for those coming from other countries in search of a better life. The bill before us today will end the asylum system as we know it and eliminate humanitarian protections for people coming to the United States. Many asylum seekers are escaping conditions that we cannot fathom. Yet, here we are debating a measure that will subject them to more cruelty. Cruelty is the point, but cruelty will not fix our broken immigration system. This bill will make it nearly impossible to seek asylum at the border, open protections for unaccompanied minors, and mandate that all asylum-seeking families be detained indefinitely, regardless if they are with children. These policies will only exacerbate the extreme suffering. Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, I yield the gentlelady an additional minute.
These policies will only exacerbate the extreme suffering occurring at the southern border. If Republicans really wanted to address this crisis, they will join Democrats to pass real, comprehensive immigration reform. I urge my colleagues to oppose this cruel, draconian bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gooden.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. None of us in this chamber thought that we would have a president, even as a Democrat, that would let the country get this way. Strengthening our national security and prioritizing the well-being of the American people should be a bipartisan issue. This is the strongest border security bill to come to the House floor in decades. But my colleagues on the other side of the aisle refuse to support this common-sense legislation, instead using terms like cruel and horrible and heartless Republicans. The American people won't fall for that, and they don't fall for that. And the Biden administration has created a humanitarian and security crisis unlike anything we have ever seen. They've outright refused to enforce the law, prioritizing the livelihoods of illegal aliens over American citizens. Drug cartels are running rampant. NGOs are handing out debit cards and bus tickets to migrants, paid for with our taxpayer dollars. And human traffickers are targeting migrant children. It is heartless to do nothing about that and let the status quo continue. But in fact, it gets worse tonight at midnight. When Title 42 lifts today, or tonight at midnight, we will see yet another migrant surge to add to the historic numbers this administration has already amassed. The Secure Border Act strengthens protections for migrant children during a time when the Biden administration is losing over 85,000 unaccompanied minor children due to foolish and reckless practices. This bill protects migrant children, American citizens, and American workers. H.R. 2 has my full support, and I urge my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to join the American people in our fight to secure our nation. I yield back.
The gentleman from California reserves, and the gentleman from New York is recognized.
I reserve.
The gentleman from New York reserves, and the gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, one of the moving forces behind this bill.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman from California. We're here today because of the abject failure of the administration to do its fundamental duty to protect the United States. We have a wide open border, empowering cartels, empowering China to the detriment of the American citizens and to the migrants that seek to come here, supposedly in the name of compassion. But that is in the false name of compassion. Dead migrants lying along the Rio Grande and in ranches in South Texas. The extent to which migrants suffer in the Texas heat, 53 dying in a tractor trailer last summer in San Antonio. Thousands being sold into the sex trafficking trade, being used as crass political pawns by a party devoid of anything substantive to take this country forward. But Republicans are standing up strongly to make sure that this country will stand for the rule of law. that sets our country apart around the globe and attracts so many to want to come here. Border Patrol right now apprehended over 10,000 migrants on both Monday and 11,000 Tuesday, the highest single-day totals ever recorded. 26,000 gotaways, 660,000 migrants waiting in Mexico. The president of Guatemala confirming 80,000 Venezuelan migrants are traveling to the U.S. ahead of Title 42's expiration. 15,000 Venezuelan migrants crossed into Brownsville. Border Patrol Chief Raul Ortiz said he estimates 60,000 to 65,000 migrants are in northern Mexico. I got a text from a local law enforcement yesterday saying, quote, "We are almost at Broken Arrow. Every sector is near 150% capacity. DHS is calling for border agents from other north and coast sectors to help the southern border." The first 550 in a group of 1,500 service members of the Army and Marines were set to arrive. A shootout between the Mexican Army and human smugglers erupted at the Far Reynosa International Bridge. Schools in El Paso are adding more security. El Paso ran out of shelter. El Paso declared an emergency. Brownsville declared an emergency. Laredo declared an emergency. San Antonio is preparing. Their migrant shelters are expressing concerns over being overwhelmed. Even our nation's capital is being overwhelmed. And now the New York City mayor, a sanctuary city, criticizing busing, is busing migrants outside of New York City out to the suburbs because my Democratic colleagues and the Democratic administration and Democratic leaders in so-called sanctuary cities don't give a whit about migrants. It's about political power. And they are costing lives. They are endangering Americans. They are causing children to die from fentanyl poisoning, and they know it. And that is what is so pathetic and sad. But Republicans offer legislation today that would force this administration to do the job it refuses to do. By ending the magnet, by stopping the releases, by forcing us to do the job we're supposed to do to protect unaccompanied children from being on the top of train cars, being subjected to the abuses of cartels, holding families together while we adjudicate claims of asylum, and yes, provide for a path for asylum while making sure we don't create a magnet for the abuse of migrants in the false name of compassion. Republicans are leading. We are doing the job that the president refuses to do. The American people know it. They're going to see it. And my Democratic colleagues are going to suffer the consequences for this abject failure. I yield back.
The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I rise in strong opposition to the Child Deportation Act. This effort will rip apart families, dismantle due process, and expose children to abuse and trafficking. This bill goes further than simply demolishing legal pathways that the president has put in place. It strips back critical safeguards that protect the safety and well-being of unaccompanied minors. Instead of getting their day in court, this bill would imprison kids for up to 30 days. Instead of reunifying children with family who are here legally, this bill would deliver them to traffickers and other bad actors. And instead of providing care and counsel to children, this bill would weaken child welfare standards and reduce vetting of sponsors, leaving them vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. This legislation makes a mockery of our nation's values to appeal to our nation's worst impulses. Mr. Speaker, this effort to block access to asylum will fuel criminal traffickers that extort desperate migrants. To make it all very simple, this bill will plunge our border into chaos. And that is exactly what my Republican colleagues want. They demonize immigrants, they lock up kids, and they defund border security just so they can blame Democrats for the crisis that they manufacture. Let me just give you an example of the Homestead Migrant Children Detention Center that existed in Homestead, Florida, back in 2019 in the previous administration. This was a facility that warehoused unaccompanied minors. The conditions were so challenging, and the kids crammed so tightly together under conditions where they were forced to literally have very little space between one another and be imprisoned, essentially, in this detention center that eventually it was forced to shut down. When President Biden took action to allow Venezuelan, Cuban, and Haitian migrants to apply for humanitarian parole, reducing border encounters from these countries by over 90%, Republican attorneys general filed a lawsuit to stop him. My Republican colleagues trumpet the need for oversight, but when I introduced legislation to prohibit child detention centers from refusing access to members to conduct that oversight, deafening silence. They scold Democrats on enforcement, yet promise to slash border funding to pre-pandemic levels, leaving border officers without vital resources to combat fentanyl and human trafficking. The only thing this bill will actually secure is the chokehold grip that MAGA extremists have on the Republican Party. I urge my colleagues to reject this legislation. It would brutally harm children for the sake of cheap political points. Our border should be governed by laws upholding our humanity, not by demagogues promoting bigotry. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Lesko.
The gentlelady is recognized.
I'm from a border state, and I've been to the border multiple times, and there is absolutely an invasion at our southern border. Even worse, Title 42 ends today. Without Title 42, the number of illegal immigrants at our southern border is expected to skyrocket. The Biden administration has no plan. And in fact, I heard multiple times from my Democratic colleagues today how we should work together on a comprehensive plan. May I remind my Democratic colleagues that they were in total control of the House, the Senate, and the presidency for the last 2 years, and you did absolutely nothing. The Secure the Border Act is the solution. This bill disincentivizes illegal immigration, ends catch and release, builds the wall, and reinstates President Trump's successful Remain in Mexico policy. Republicans want secure borders. Republicans want to protect our communities from deadly fentanyl. Republicans want to protect the innocent immigrant children from being sold into sex slavery like is happening today. It's time to pass this legislation and secure the border now because President Biden won't. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized. The gentleman from New York reserves, and the gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the author of one of the other measures in this package, Judge Carter of Texas.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you for recognizing me, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of H.R. 2, the Secure the Border Act. House Republicans are fulfilling the promises to restore safety and security at our borders, furthering the goals outlined in the House Republican Commitment to America. Included in this border package is my bill, the Protection of Children Act. We know that human traffickers, cartels, and coyotes exploit children in order to line their pockets and then abandon them at the border. These children are then subject to a very slow-moving bureaucratic system, all the while being separated from their families. My Protection of Children Act gives these children a choice and closes loopholes to end the exploitation of children. By returning these children to their home country quickly and safely, we prevent these children from experiencing the further trauma of detention and being released to potential strangers and drawn out in long adjudication process. I want to thank Representative Briggs, Representative Nails for their co-sponsoring my Child Protection Act. I want to thank the Homeland Security and Judiciary and House on Foreign Affairs for what they've done on this legislation. And I'd like to point out something. When I was the chairman of Homeland Security Appropriations, I was in Laredo in 14 at the bus station. There were 700 people waiting to go somewhere. And they told me 2 people spoke Spanish or English. None of the children spoke Spanish or English. And they were going to be released into this country once they left Laredo with no one to help them. We should take these people, make this thing right, and do the right thing. And I ask about the kids and they said, send them back where they came from. That's how this bill got started. I yield back.
The gentleman from California reserves, and the gentleman from New York is recognized.
Reserve.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm now pleased to yield 3 minutes to one of the leaders in our conference in confronting this crisis, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for his effort on this legislation. And so many have worked hard on this. You know, when I've been listening to my colleagues across the aisle and all of the just gaslighting, I'm reminded of the secondary output produced by many of the dairy cows in rural Arizona. While you are ignoring this problem, Mr. Speaker, my colleagues across the aisle, right now, record numbers of people coming across this border. You know what? In Matamoros, right there at the Rio Grande, you've got the immigration authorities of Mexico coordinating with CBP on controlled crossings of the river. Why is that? Because Title 42 has gone away today. It's going to go away tonight. The cartels control our border. We've had testimony. The chief of CBP has said that. And when I've heard some of the stuff I've heard here, I said, I wonder if any of them even know where the border is. Come on down to the border. I will show you what it's like. You know what CBP officials told local officials in Arizona about Title 42? And I'm quoting here, you're screwed. You won't do anything to solve the border problem. This bill solves much of the border problem. And I get a kick out of someone here who just made a reference to how bad things were and how we didn't do anything. Yuma sector, 2020, in apprehensions for the entire fiscal year, 8,800. You know what it is today, this fiscal year? Over 350,000. You know what it was last year? Over 300,000. Why is that? Because what the CBP doesn't, they don't say, hey, let's do the Democrat plan. They say, can you at least just let us enforce the law? This administration says no. And thus we have a crisis on the border. It's more than a crisis, it's cataclysmic. You know, in Darien Gap in Panama, the numbers crossing 500% increase. The number between 700,000 to 1 million people just waiting, coming on up, waiting for Title 42 to go away. You know what expedited removal means? It means expedited release into the country. It means community release. Why is that? Because of the weak asylum enforcement laws that we have today. So when you come up, if we're taking you back to the border, we don't get you across the border and you say, I want asylum. Doesn't matter what your history is or anything. We're going to get you out of here and release you. Community release. Community release means right now you're getting released. That's what's happening. Shame on you. I yield.
The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Reserve.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 2 minutes to my colleague from California, Mr. Issa.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. When I received my current district in redistricting, I was pleased that it was a border district all along the Mexican border from the Tijuana area all the way through the rest of the county. It isn't a border area today. There is no border. And if there is no border with Mexico, then there is no border with America. Every day, people pass through. Some are found, some are not found, some are stopped for a period of time, but few are turned away. And they're not turned away because we simply have a policy of letting everyone in. Now, I also represent a major agricultural district with ranching and farming. And guess what? with all those millions of people that this administration has deliberately allowed to come in without having been invited, without pre-screening, without an application, we still have a shortage because of the policies of simply catch and release with parole. But I'll tell you what else my district is dealing with. We're dealing with enough fentanyl seized last year, 117,000 pounds. If divided equally, it would kill every person in America in one dose. Just last week, the California Highway Patrol seized $21 million worth of fentanyl well into the United States on its way to LA. That would be enough fentanyl to kill every San Diegan. That's what we're dealing with because we have no border. Now, my Democrat friends, Mr. Speaker, will tell you about how it's not good enough, we need to have comprehensive. Like you, Mr. Speaker, I have pushed for comprehensive reform, but comprehensive reform is not simply to normalize what is going on. Comprehensive reform has to be a balance of enforcement and fair immigration rules. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Van Drew.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 2 minutes.
You know, I think we all know that we're a nation of immigrants, but we are also a nation of the rule of law. And as President Reagan once said years ago, a nation that can't control its borders is not a nation. And we're rapidly moving there, very rapidly. At this very moment, we don't have control of our southern border. Tens of thousands of migrants are marching, waiting, and illegally crossing our borders every day, with tens of thousands more well on their way. We are witnessing one of the worst humanitarian crises in our history of our nation. Migrants are dying from starvation, from disease, from lack of water. Women and children are being trafficked and they're being abused. Our administration, they knew this was coming. They knew it, yet they have no plan. How irresponsible is that? With Title 42 set to expire tonight and no concrete plan in place to handle this situation, we're facing a crisis of epic proportions. And this crisis will result in communities suffering, migrants suffering, and our nation suffering. But it isn't too late. It still isn't too late. We can secure our borders and we can protect our citizens. It will take leadership and a willingness to reject talking points and a willingness to do what's best for our nation and for our people. And right now, it's the House Republicans who are standing up, and right now they're the ones making the effort. This bill restarts the border wall. It hires more CBP agents. It ends incentives to abuse unaccompanied minors. It ends catch and release. It reinstates the Remain in Mexico policy. We need action. Action from our leaders, real leaders. Action from our elected officials, and action from those who have the power to make a difference. And I thank the gentleman from California for bringing this forward.
The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I ask how much time we have remaining?
The gentleman has 15 minutes remaining.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I'm now pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Fitzgerald.
The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank Chairman Jordan, Chairman Green, and Chairman McCall for their leadership and contributions to the bill that we see before us today. I just wanted to comment briefly on kind of my experience and what I saw at the border at the invitation of members of the Judiciary Committee. I was able to kind of see, I think, two different, very diverse parts of the border. First and foremost, in McAllen, Texas, where we spent a couple of days and had an opportunity not only to talk border agents themselves, but also sat through a full presentation by Homeland Security. One of the things that struck me, and I think is very pertinent to what we're discussing today, is every time I asked a border agent or every time I spoke with someone from Homeland Security, I would say, what can we do as members of Congress? Because a lot of times you go on these trips and you know, they're tours, and you feel like when you're done, it's overwhelming, and you really want to know kind of how can we have an impact. And I think what made an impression on me was every person I spoke to said Title 42. I don't think you could find somebody probably at the times when I was at the border that could really describe what Title 42 meant or what the impact would be. But guess what? Those agents knew. They knew what it meant. They meant it would be a unbelievable unleashing of many different factions of people that were immigrating for any number of reasons across the border. And they knew it was going to overwhelm them. So here, as we stand here today and debate this bill and watch the very, quite honestly, when you're watching it on TV right now, it's overwhelming. You can see the masses of people that are gathering. So it's timely for the bill, and I want once again thank Chairman Jordan and Chairman Green for pulling all this together. And I yield back.
Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from New York is. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Fry.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support today of H.R. 2, the Secure the Border Act of 2023. You know, for years, we have heard from this administration, we have heard from our colleagues across the aisle that we are imagining a border crisis, that there is nothing to see, that everything is fine on our southern border. We are not imagining an increase in human trafficking. We are not imagining the dramatic escalation of fentanyl and fentanyl poisoning in our country. We are not imagining 5 million people who have entered this country illegally, the 1.2 million gotaways, or the nearly 100 people that were on the terror watch list since this president took office. We are not imagining a border crisis. Cartels are making $13 billion a year off of smuggling people into this country. We are destabilizing an entire country because we are failing to act. This doesn't include what they're making off the drugs they smuggle either. This, quite simply, Mr. Speaker, is unconscionable. While we're bankrolling the cartels, we are bankrupting our country. You know, I visited the southern border. And I wish that more colleagues across the aisle would have done the same, because when you go down there and you listen to farmers, ranchers, family members, hospital systems, people all over from every walk of life, they say the same thing. And I asked them at our hearing, is the border secure? And the resounding answer from the entire crowd of several hundred was no. Do you feel safe in your community? No again. We see this time and time again from this administration where they have failed to act and put our nation in jeopardy. This crisis is a drain on law enforcement, it is a drain on hospitals, it is a drain on taxpayers and the resources across the board. You know, South Carolina is 2,000 miles away from the border, but we, like every single state, are a border state. We see the fentanyl in our communities. We see what is happening on the southern border. We see what is going on in our neighborhoods across this country. Our entire nation is dealing with the effects of Joe Biden's border crisis. It is the federal government's primary responsibility to protect our nation and secure our borders, but that is not happening. We must resume construction of the wall. We must hire more Border Patrol agents. We must end catch and release, and we must pass this bill.
Time has expired. Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Bentz.
The gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of H.R. 2. This country must have an immigration system that works. If our nation is going to compete with China, we have to have an immigration system that works. If our nation is going to continue to feed the world, we need a system that works. If our nation is going to continue to build infrastructure, roads, buildings, and structures that our economy needs. We need an immigration system that works. If our nation is going to take care of its elderly and sick and retired, we need a system that works. If our nation is going to compete at the highest level of AI and computer chip manufacturing, we need an immigration system that works. If our nation is to have an economy that's not starving for workers, we need an immigration system that works. But to have an immigration system that works, we have to have a border that works. And our border is broken. The hundreds of thousands of people coming across the border every day do not support an immigration system that works, do not reflect an immigration system that works. Mr. Speaker, we need to fix the border first, and then we can fix our immigration system. This is the first step, the first absolutely essential and necessary step to provide a foundation for a comprehensive revision of our immigration system. Mr. Speaker, I urge support for H.R. 2, and I will be voting for it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I think we're ready to close.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2.5 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Stanton.
The gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to H.R. 2. I am deeply frustrated by the administration's failure to adequately prepare for the end of Title 42, and my constituents in Arizona are as well. They know that the administration could have and should have done more to prepare for this day. That's the simple truth. But the bill before us today does nothing to make the border states like mine safer. It does not ensure an orderly and humane legal asylum process, and even makes it more difficult for refugees from countries like Cuba and Ukraine to seek asylum here. It does not stop the flow of deadly drugs like fentanyl into our communities. In fact, it diverts law enforcement resources from going after drug traffickers and smugglers. This bill demands much more from the Customs and Border Protection officers, but does not provide the necessary funding for CBP to manage the surge of traffic, leaving our ports and our nation more vulnerable and less secure. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle even want to eliminate federal funding that faith-based and local aid groups depend on to shelter, feed, and clothe migrants. Without those shelters, there would be even more street releases by Border Patrol into communities like Phoenix and Tucson. That's inhumane. My amendment to strike that part of this bill, they wouldn't even give it a vote. And make no mistake, if signed into law, H.R. 2 would hurt our economy, especially in my home state of Arizona. Every employer that I've met with in the district, from farmers to contractors to high-tech manufacturing companies, tell me that they can't find enough skilled workers. This bill does nothing to strengthen workforce pipelines. It actually makes hiring more difficult. All of these things, Mr. Speaker, show that this proposal is not a serious one. Instead of sabotaging an already broken immigration system, I invite my colleagues across the aisle to help us modernize it. Common sense reforms would help us rebuild our nation's infrastructure, invest in domestic manufacturing, create jobs, improve trade with Mexico, and combat inflation. Now my colleagues across the aisle say our first priority should be securing our southern border. I agree. The situation at our border is dire. There's no getting around it.
The gentleman additional 30 seconds.
Thank you very much,
Gentleman's
Chairman.
yield an extra 30 seconds.
The situation at our border is dire. There's no getting around it, and Congress and the administration must do more. But one of the things we can do to secure our border is to modernize the immigration system. These are not incompatible goals. Any serious proposal must do both. And I'm ready to work in good faith to find a path forward, and I'll be at the table. My colleagues across the aisle are ready to do the same. I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition to H.R. 2, the Child Deportation Act. I rise today because seeking asylum is a human right, because we are a nation of immigrants. I migrated to the U.S. when I was 9, but the same pathways to citizenship that enabled me to become a citizen and to become a member of Congress no longer exist. Our immigration system has become more restrictive. Our border is more militarized. But this Republican bill is the cruelest we've seen in a long time. It destroys asylum. It doubles down on detention. It puts kids in jail. It's a bill intended to rally the base by vilifying immigrants. It's straight out of the Tucker Carlson playbook. Migrants make the journey through rivers and jungles on trucks and in trains. They make the journey out of desperation and out of fear. We need an immigration system rooted in compassion and opportunity, not like this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have?
The gentleman has 11 3/4 minutes remaining.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Florida, Mr. Frost.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today because Republicans in this chamber want to scream and shout about our broken immigration system while putting forth the most unserious, cruel bill that is effectively dead on arrival in the Senate and fixes absolutely nothing. This bill is a rerun of Donald Trump's biggest failures and inhumane border policies. This is the Child Deportation Act because that's exactly what this does. It doesn't address any single issue at the border. It doesn't create pathways to citizenship for those legally attempting to receive asylum, which is a right in this country. It focuses on expediting child deportation and detaining unaccompanied minors, and even spending millions of your taxpayer dollars on a pointless border wall. Floridians back in my home state know that this is nothing less than hateful, unserious legislation because we're watching Governor Ron DeSantis do the same thing, spending millions to detain and fly migrants for a political show while criminalizing vulnerable people and families. The American people sent us here to work, and instead GOP leadership offers them a pointless bill after pointless bill that only proves how hateful right-wing policy can become. I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Florida, Mr. Soto.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At 11:59 tonight, we'll see the end of Title 42, and President Biden has been stepping up to meet the moment. We secured additional border security patrol officers in our omnibus. We have a new parole program to help out with countries like Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Haiti, where we're seeing a lot of folks come to the border. And we also see 1,500 troops going down there. In this moment, this body should be working together in a bipartisan fashion. We should be coming together to help with a supplemental, to help with the funding that we need down there at the border, not a messaging bill, not a political points potshot bill at a time when the clock is ticking. This body could do so much more if we work together. I've been down to the border, Mr. Speaker. We know what works. Sensors and technology work to help make sure we have border awareness across the southern border. Having more custom border protection agents to be able to work on apprehensions, getting civilians to do processing of asylum. We should be funding a bill that does those things. And Mr. Speaker, we don't have the southern border in Florida. We have ports, and we've had a lot of challenges with those ports. This bill doesn't do anything for our ports. It does nothing for the ports of entry, our front lines in the Sunshine State. We see Governor DeSantis, on the other hand, has a law coming in Florida that's going to attack hospitals. It's going to attack nonprofits. It's going to hurt agriculture. It's going to hurt construction at a time when we need to lower food prices and build more affordable housing. We're already seeing crops not be picked in the field as fear comes over the Sunshine State and construction sites abandoned. This isn't going to help immigration at all, but what it will do is jack up inflation and food prices at a time when we need to work together. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Ready to close.
Speakers, I'm prepared to close.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, organizations, associations, and industry leaders from across the political spectrum oppose passage of H.R. 2, the Child Deportation Act. They include among them the American Immigration Lawyers Association, Service Employees International Union, AFL-CIO, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, Kids in Need of Defense, UNIDOS, and the National Education Association. This bill is a microcosm of what we have seen the first 4.5 months of this new Republican majority, a chaotic majority that has no real interest in legislating or making positive change. Instead, they pass cruel and unworkable messaging bills that have no chance of becoming law, are dead in the U.S. Senate, and then pat themselves on the back. I urge my colleagues to oppose this draconian and unworkable bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know how to secure our borders and protect our country. We had done so under the Trump administration. The Remain in Mexico policy had slowed illegal immigration and phony asylum claims to a trickle. The border wall was nearing completion. ICE was actually enforcing court-ordered deportations. All of that changed when the Democrats seized control of our government and reversed all of these policies. And the result we can now see all around us. It's affecting our schools, our hospitals, law enforcement, working families' wages, and social services that are now strained to the breaking point and soon beyond the breaking point. This bill simply restores those policies that worked and makes it more difficult for a future president to refuse to faithfully execute the laws. I would ask the American people to watch the catastrophe that is unfolding right now on our collapsing southern border. What we are seeing is something historic. It is a mass illegal migration on a scale the world has never seen and that no civilization has ever survived. At this hour, history is screaming this warning at us that countries that either cannot or will not protect their borders simply aren't around very long. Without enforcing our immigration laws, we have no immigration laws. Without immigration laws, we have no borders. And without borders, we have no country. Let that not be the epitaph of the American Republic. This, what Lincoln called the last best hope of mankind on this earth. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, each control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Speaker, in my 20 years in Congress, including when I was chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, and as a former federal prosecutor tasked with securing our border in Texas, I've never seen our border this chaotic, this broken. What we are witnessing today is unprecedented. Right now, as I speak, there's a tidal wave of migrants marching across our southern border. Just yesterday, CBP apprehended over 10,000 migrants, 10,000 in a single day. This is the largest human trafficking crisis I have ever witnessed in my lifetime. And it's time for Congress to act and restore control to this uncontrolled border. Well, the administration and DHS Secretary Mayorkas have assured us, quote, the border is closed, unquote, and that they have operational control of the border. Just last month, Border Patrol Chief Ortiz testified that DHS does not have operational control of the border because the drug cartels have operational control of the border. I know that. I've been down there. I've seen this movie before, but this is the worst movie I've seen. And it didn't have to happen. It was a self-inflicted wound. That is because on day one, the Biden administration rescinded the migrant protection protocols, otherwise known as Remain in Mexico. In my many meetings with Border Patrol agents down on the border, they tell me very bluntly that the rescission of these policies by President Biden on the very first day in office has had a direct cause and effect on the chaos at the border. This policy was working under the last administration. Illegal immigration was dramatically declining. However, since President Biden took office in January of 2021, we are witnessing a massive increase in illegal immigrant encounters and apprehensions at our southern border. 5 million of them. The numbers don't lie. Since President Biden took office, I repeat, there have been over 5 million migrant encounters with at least 1.4 million known getaways. What is going to happen to these people? They have no legal status. They live in the shadows. The young girls are sex trafficked. The young boys and men their home will be MS-13. And worse, more than 100,000 Americans have died from fentanyls flowing across the border, going from China to Mexico and across my state of Texas. That is nearly double the number of deaths in the entire Vietnam War over 2 decades. And 853 migrants and counting have died trying to make the dangerous journey across the border just last year alone. This is the most recorded in history. 35% of women and children are raped and sexually abused throughout their journey at the hands of the brutal cartels. And what happens when they get here? Well, we know that Mayorkas lifted the restrictions so that sponsors of these children do not have to be vetted. What are we seeing? 10, 20, 30 children being sent to the same house to their sponsors who have not been vetted. This turns into a major trafficking problem right here inside the United States. And when the cartels say you still need to pay us more money, you need to run more drugs, you need to prostitute yourself, we are creating a criminal network right now inside the United States of America. And it's only going to get worse, particularly when Title 42 is lifted today, the very day we're going to pass this bill. Most, from my point of view as a former chairman of Homeland Security, 98 suspected terrorists attempted to enter the homeland last year. When I chaired Homeland, I always asked the question, how many special interest aliens, how many on the terror watch list have tried to get in, how many have gotten in. And that's just who we know about. Think about the threat, the national security threat to the homeland, particularly after the collapse of Afghanistan and the rise of terrorism overseas. I would argue that President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas are complicit in this crisis. You know, the federal government's job is to secure borders, air, land, and sea. Unfortunately, this administration has failed to do so. They've abdicated their solemn duty to protect the homeland, to protect the American people, to protect these children. One rescission, one stroke of the pen, rescinding the Remain in Mexico policy created this chaos at the border. Don't take my word for it. Take the chief of Border Patrol's word for it. Take the countless Border Patrol officers and agents I've talked to down on the border. That's why I introduced this legislation, to compel the administration to solve this crisis once and for all. Congress is doing what the Biden administration has failed to do for the last 2.5 years, to fix our broken borders. Our first priority must be to stem the massive flow of illegal aliens by reinstating and codifying the migrant protection protocols known as Remain in Mexico, because it worked. In my state, we have a saying, if it's not broken, don't fix it. It wasn't broken. It was working. They rescinded it, and now we have this crisis. This legislation will also direct the State Department to renegotiate the asylum cooperation agreements. These agreements prohibit migrants who traveled throughout any countries with asylum agreements from eligibility for asylum in the United States. Asylum is the magnet. It's the pull factor that's being abused by the cartels to make money off these children and these women and these migrants. This policy was very effective, and it worked under the prior administration. Reinstating it is a proven solution to reduce the chaos, the crisis. And by directing the Secretary of State to reauthorize and codify MPP and the ACAs, this bill bolsters the work being done on asylum reform and border security in both the House Judiciary Committee and the House Homeland Security Committee. Finally, I would say this should not be a partisan issue. When I chaired the Homeland Security Committee, Ranking Member Thompson and I worked on many border security bills that were bipartisan. Many passed unanimously out of our committee. Yet here we are in this partisan fight. I think the American people deserve better than partisanship. They deserve solutions. In my state, we witness this every day. Ranchers seeing dead bodies on their property, the drugs flowing in. Well, Secretary Mayorkas, you asked for a bill. Well, here it is. Here it is. And it's time that we instate the policies that have a proven track record of success. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong opposition to H.R. 2. Title 3 of this bill happens to fall under the House Foreign Affairs Committee's jurisdiction, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Nice.
You know, there is undoubtedly a need to fix our broken immigration system. I think that we could all agree about it. And it's undoubtedly correct that Congress needs to get involved in that. What Congress is not doing is talking about coming together for a comprehensive immigration reform. If we want to get at the heart of how to improve in a humane way, and protect our borders, we would be locked together to talk about comprehensive immigration reform, and that will keep us true to who we are and our values. Because sometimes when I'm listening to this debate and some of the policies that are here, I'm saying, who are we? Who are we as a people, as a nation? Do we practice what we preach? Or do we say to others, do what we say, not what we do? American values are important here. Title III seeks to codify and reinstate the Trump administration's failed migrant protection protocols, known as MPP, and remain in Mexico policy. This is a disturbing and ineffective policy, returned asylum seekers at the border to Mexico and only allowed them to enter the United States for their court proceedings. Listening to my colleague, return them to Mexico. That's it. And because there are thousands of backlog cases and too few judges to effectively handle them, those that we return to Mexico, these asylum seekers, are forced to live in Mexican border towns for long periods of time, and as a result of that, the exact same thing that my colleague talked about, where these borders in Mexico, these border towns, they are the ones that are dangerous. They are the reasons why people are raped. That's where the violence and the crime. They do not have, these towns in Mexico, the capacity to safely house the thousands of people fleeing their countries of origin. We know that migrants face violence of all kinds, including murder, rape, trafficking, and kidnapping, as they awaited their court appearance. The very thing, what we do agree, that's happening to these individuals, but we put blinders on. Just send them back. That'll solve the problem. Live in the tent encampments without adequate access to the basics. Just send them back to Mexico. Let them stay there. No clean water, no sanitation, no shelter, no health service. Send them back. We don't care. The MPP puts tens of thousands of migrants in greater danger, including families with children who we're supposed to care about. It also puts America at odds with our regional partners in ways that were and still are detriment to our national security and our global standing. And I'm so, like Mr. McCall, I've been here for 25 years. Focused and look, I've got many families in my district who come to me all of the time asking for humanitarian concerns and asking for us to pass a comprehensive immigration reform. Our global standing. While nations like Colombia and Peru took in millions of Venezuelans crossing their border in desperate need of safety, America, the United States of America, the most resourced nation on earth, a nation of immigrants, we turned our backs on asylum seekers and our very own values in the name of deterrence. Turn our backs. We don't care. Send them back. as CARICOM continues to work in a regional and multilateral way to find solutions to help Haiti, our neighbor in crises, this body debates unilateral action that fails to see the collective challenge facing this hemisphere. This bill is more than just short-sighted. It is cruel and harmful to our interests. We should be embarrassed, absolutely embarrassed, that Colombia's migration agency had suspended a program meant to return Colombian nationals, found the U.S. border with Mexico due to cruel and degrading treatment. Come on now. We are facing a regional and global migration crisis, and we have strong and divergent opinions about improving an imperfect immigration process and how to address the recent surge in migration since the pandemic. But Title III of this bill seeks to codify and reinitiate failed processes from the last administration that do not solve the real life challenges regarding the movement of people, those people fleeing from instability and violence and lack of economic opportunity in education and in their home countries. Why? Because apparently we don't care. We don't care. Send them back. Who cares what happens to them? Send them back. We don't have comprehensive immigration reform to make sure that we're working and fixing this system, because that's what we should be working on. This isn't the first surge of migrants on our border, and it won't be the last, particularly as climate change will further limit resources and displace people across the region. To solve complex multi-country challenges, we must invest in multilateral solutions. When we invest in multilateral solutions, as we are doing in other parts of the world, that's how we win. Not America alone, America by ourselves. That's not leadership. No one follows you if you're just by yourself, saying just not working with others and our allies. The Los Angeles Declaration on Migration and Protection from the Summit of the Americas in 2022 included proposals for collaborative problem solving on this issue, with leaders across the region to address the root causes of forced displacement and irregular migration. Working with our allies, as we're doing in other parts of the world, as we're doing with our NATO allies, as we're doing with our EU allies, as we're doing with our Indo-Pacific allies. We should be doing the same thing with our Western Hemisphere allies. Why? Because our strength is not rooted in the sticks we use to coerce outcomes, but in the depth of our relationships, our collaboration across the region to address the root causes of forced displacement and irregular migration, and including by combating corruption and impunity, holding our obligations to protect refugees, and partnering to promote opportunity and prosperity for people and communities, especially those most vulnerable across the region. You know, we talk a lot, and I talk for myself. When I get on my knees at night and pray, when I'm in church and pray, when I read books that I believe in, they talk about taking care of the poor, taking care of those who can't take care of themselves. When I eat my dinner or my lunch or my breakfast and I pray, I say, bless those who are hungry and no food. Bless those who may have food and no appetite. Bless those who have least than me. We are the richest country in the world. Let's go at resolving the root causes. This bill doesn't address the migration crises. It only creates further chaos by shutting the door on mechanisms that reunite families. That's what I believe. That's what I pray. That's what I think what mankind is all about, or should be all about. Keeping people safe from perilous journeys to our border. But these attempts to sow seeds of fear and distrust about migrants are as counterproductive as they are reprehensible. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, the border bill undermines Congress's bipartisan work to grant humanitarian parole to hundreds of thousands of Afghans. We've been working together on that, and we should be working together to help those that's trying to cross the border from our Western Hemisphere allies. But this also prevents and goes against thousands of Afghans, Ukrainians, and others by restricting DHS parole authority. And so, if we are truly interested in a constructive agenda that's aimed at providing viable and durable solutions to migration challenges, I stand ready, Democrats stand ready, to collaborate on addressing the root causes of migration through congressional action, through working on a comprehensive immigration reform, to trying to make sure that we show and we live true to our values, that we become the shining example for others, in other countries who are looking at us to see how we react to it. And we should do that by showing in a bipartisan way we're ready for comprehensive immigration reform, and we will do it in a bipartisan way, and we will do it so that we can also maintain our values and who we are, at least who we say we are, as a nation. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I'd just like to state for the record, we put in this bill a provision specifically that those paroled in the United States from Afghanistan, if this would not affect their legal status, that they can stay here in the United States. With that, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Bost, the chairman of the Committee on Veterans Affairs.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Chairman McCall. Just last month, I went to Del Rio sector of the U.S.-Mexican border to visit with our dedicated Border Patrol agents. Over 15,000 frontline Border Patrol agents are veterans, serving their country and communities again, working to keep America safe. However, our Commander-in-Chief has failed to give them the resources and structure they need to effectively do their job. They're pulling drowning children out of the river. They're finding bodies left behind that were being smuggled across and been thrown in the bushes. Speaker, these agents are fighting a new battle back at home as well. And that is the mental strain on them as the results of President Biden's open border policies cannot be ignored. So much of that VA had to deploy, so much so that VA actually had to deploy a mobile veterans center to the border to offer mental health services to our veterans and even our non-veterans agents, border agents who are there. Speaker, I heard it firsthand from the brave men and women that need this bill. Securing our border shouldn't be a Republican or a Democrat issue. The people who suffer the most when we make doing our hyper-political are the veterans, law enforcement officers who are just simply trying to do their job. That's a disservice to them, And I want to urge my colleagues to support this common sense bill. It is vitally important. I've looked at them in the eye, and I would advise anyone on the other side of the aisle or on my side of the aisle that have not went down and looked them in the eye, you'll know what they're suffering through because we're not doing our job and the administration's not doing theirs. And that's why I encourage for the support of this bill, and with that, I yield back the balance of my
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, an esteemed member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Representative Sidney Kamlager Dove.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Ranking Member. I rise today to strongly oppose H.R. 2, House Republicans' Child Deportation Act. Yes, our immigration system is broken, but instead of productive, bipartisan legislation that would work to fix it, Republicans want to double down on immoral, cruel, and inhumane Trump-era policies that hurt children and families and stoke fear and greater division. With Title 42 set to expire today, we should take this opportunity as a chance to address the humanitarian crisis at our border by focusing on solutions that alleviate pressures at our border and fundamentally change the dysfunction and chaos that is happening. Instead, this bill would make our immigration crisis that much worse. H.R. 2 would require expedited deportations and expanded detention for unaccompanied children, impose new restrictions on asylum while threatening to end the asylum system as we know it, detain even more migrant families in facilities with poor and unacceptable conditions, resume President Trump's failed policy of building a border wall, and so much more. I hope the American people heard some of the statements made by my Republican colleagues when this bill was heard in committee. Republicans dog whistle, fearmonger, lie, and resort to conspiracy theories about our border to hide the fact that they have no real solutions to this growing crisis. Harmful policies meant to exacerbate confusion, waste more money, and hurt people fleeing dangerous situations is not the answer. Many are fleeing war zones, areas of conflict, countries that employ torture, violence, rape, and ethnic cleansing as tactics of control. And what are we proposing to do with H.R. 2? Be a cruel neighbor and throw them back into harm's way while telling Mexico to shoulder much of this burden. America is supposed to be a nation of immigrants. We are supposed to have compassion for those seeking asylum. Republican policies like H.R. 2 run counter to those very fundamental values. Unlike some of my GOP colleagues, I do not for 1 second believe that immigrants from Mexico are a threat to us. If anything, the threats we face are homegrown. They take the form of xenophobic, transphobic, and hateful individuals who twist the meaning of the Constitution to fit their own political agendas. As for this drug myth, over 80% of drugs smuggled...
I'll give the lady additional 30 seconds.
The lady is recognized for an extra 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As for the drug myth, over 80% of drugs smuggled into our country are done by Americans, not immigrants. Let's get serious and talk about meaningful steps towards immigration reform that include what it means to be a global partner in this space, not this wildly inappropriate and ineffective bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Missouri, Ann Wagner, the Vice Chair of the Committee on Foreign Affairs and Chair of the Financial Services Subcommittee on Capital Markets.
The gentlelady from Missouri is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank Chairman McCall for yielding, and I thank him for his leadership. Mr. Speaker, in just 2 years, over 5 million illegal migrants have crossed our southern border, in addition to over 1 million known gotaways. That's equal to the entire population of my home state of Missouri. Among other malfeasance, it is undeniable that the Biden administration has created an appalling humanitarian crisis in the United States. But I want to talk about what often goes unspoken and unseen: the trafficking and exploitation of children. In February, the New York Times exposed that the Biden administration had lost 85,000 unaccompanied children released into the U.S. by the Department of Health and Human Services. These children were forced to work in dangerous conditions to pay off debts to their smugglers and cartels, and even more horrifically, their HHS, Health and Human Services designated sponsors. Despite child welfare agencies sounding the alarms on trafficking and labor exploitation, the Biden administration continued to facilitate this abuse. In fact, HHS Secretary Becerra reportedly threatened to fire his subordinates if they refused to accelerate these cruel and dangerous releases, showing no regard for the children's safety. H.R. 2, the Secure Our Border Act, addresses this catastrophe head on, and it ensures that this can never happen again. I urge all my colleagues to support this legislation. I thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I'm happy to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, Representative Don Davis.
The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Ranking Member Meeks. Mr. Speaker, I rise to express concern with H.R. 2, legislation that would place at risk United States agriculture. H.R. 2, with the E-Verify provision in particular, does not address the workforce crisis and could cause a $60 billion drop in production, resulting in a 5 to 6% increase in prices at the grocery store, when many families across America are still struggling to make it from week to week. We must develop real solutions to the labor crisis facing our farmers, ranchers, and growers. Doing a tour at the Warren Farms and speaking with farmers across eastern North Carolina, this is what they're telling me. Enough is enough. People are fed up with the divided D.C. politics. Our government must get out of the way of hard-working people. We should take H.R. 2 as drafted off the table so our farmers can continue putting food on the table for households across this great country. Congress's inaction to address the labor crisis will result in farmers losing their livelihoods. I'm here. I'm right here to work with anyone who wants to make life better for eastern North Carolina, rural America, and the American people. We can secure the border. However, we cannot secure the border while creating so much insecurity for our farm families. Mr. Speaker, I am standing with American farmers. I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Burchett, a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. G, thank you. Mr. Speaker, Americans are sick and tired of seeing the Biden administration spend millions of their taxpayer dollars to fund and enable an invasion of our southern border. This administration is using non-governmental organizations, NGOs, to push illegal immigrants all over the country. A report by the Heritage Foundation found that these illegal aliens were shipped to 431 out of 435 congressional districts. 431 congressional districts, Mr. Speaker. This report also shows the overwhelming number of resettled illegal immigrants were sent to, oddly enough, Republican districts. This is a massive resettlement program, Mr. Speaker. Under President Biden, the number of illegal immigrants entering the U.S. exceeds the population of some U.S. states. We've had over 5 million illegal crossings, plus over 1.3 million gotaways. Title 42 ends tonight, as we all know, and the flood will get worse. We've seen the pictures, Mr. Speaker. We have no idea who these people are, where they're going, or what they will do. The situation will take a huge toll on our nation and touch every community in every state. We've caught people in the past. They've been on the terrorist watch list. We have communist Chinese coming over our border. We don't know what they're up to as well. We owe it to the American people to finish the wall, catch and release programs, end catch and release policies, and close the asylum loophole that are big enough for a caravan to walk through, Mr. Speaker. President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas have dug a big hole for the American people. If we want to save this country, we need extreme border security measures to stop this open invasion now. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield the remainder of my time.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I happen to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, the ranking member on the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, Representative Joaquin Castro.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to H.R. 2, which should be known as the Child Deportation Act. Last year in my family marked 100 years since my grandmother, Victoria Castro, came to the United States as a young orphan in the wake of the Mexican Revolution. On her paperwork, the San Antonio relatives who took her in wrote that she was coming, quote, to live in the United States. From the discussions on the floor today, it seems that many of my colleagues have forgotten about the lives of the asylum seekers who will be affected by their legislation. Under this bill, for example, if a Uyghur Muslim family escapes from one of China's concentration camps in Xinjiang and seeks asylum in the United States by way of Mexico, they will be turned away. If a group of Cuban dissidents sail to Florida and land outside of a port of entry, they'll be turned away. Ukrainian families fleeing from Putin's state-sponsored kidnapping, Catholics fleeing religious persecution in Nicaragua, and Christians in Iran would all be required to remain in Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, or El Salvador at the mercy of cartels and violent gangs. Under the Trump-era Remain in Mexico policy, human rights observers recorded thousands of violent attacks against migrants, including kidnapping, rape, and other brutal crimes. That policy, as cruel as it was, included exemptions for unaccompanied minors and people who don't speak Spanish. This bill includes neither of those exemptions. H.R. 2 would also end humanitarian parole for tens of thousands of Afghan evacuees who fought side by side with our troops for over 20 years of war. These heroes and their families barely escaped from the Taliban last summer. And less than a year later, Republicans are trying to send our Afghan allies back to die. Many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle have expressed concern about how the current immigration system will be able to handle a rising tide of immigrants post-Title 42. And I agree that we need to build a more resilient, more effective, and more efficient system. But this bill is not the way to do that. Time and again, we've seen that cruel, restrictive policies like those in this bill do not stop desperate people from fleeing persecution, oppression, and violence. This bill would send the world's most vulnerable people to places where many Americans won't even drink the water. And it would force asylum seekers to take dangerous, irregular paths to the United States, the exact kind of journey that led to the deaths of 53 people in the back of a sweltering tractor trailer in my hometown of San Antonio last summer. There are meaningful bipartisan solutions to address the causes of forced migration in the United States, and I've been proud to work across the aisle to introduce several bills that would do that. But this is not the answer.
I yield the gentleman another minute.
Unfortunately, H.R. 2 does not include any serious attempt to address the root causes of migration, and it will not make any real progress to fix our nation's broken immigration system. For that reason and many others, I urge my colleagues to vote no.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to yield 2 minutes to the esteemed Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Mr. Speaker, in a few moments, House Republicans will pass the strongest border security bill this country has ever seen. Meanwhile, we are seeing a very different record from President Biden, who has only been to the border one time in 50 years. We all know what it is. We've seen it every day for over 2 years, especially now that Title 42 is expiring. Record crossings, record carelessness, and record chaos. But, Mr. Speaker, what has the House Democrats have done? What have they done to secure the border and fix the border crisis? You know, I checked, and frankly, it's nothing. To start, House Democrats skipped congressional hearings at the border. Not just one committee hearing, every single one of them. When Judiciary went with Homeland, they spent the last 2 years voting by proxy. But when it comes to securing the border, they chose to stay in Washington. They treat the border like President Biden does. Ignore it and hope that it goes away. I just don't understand why the Democrats wouldn't even show up for work. Mr. Speaker, the ranking member on the Judiciary Committee for the Democrats skipped a fentanyl-related hearing because it was, in his words, performative. Mr. Speaker, I guarantee you that the families who's lost loved ones to fentanyl, they don't think it's performative. They understand it's real. They lost the loved one. The story is just as bad when you look at the previous Congress. For 2 years, the do-nothing inflation Democrats refused to face the music, even as the evidence piled up and the American people cried out. Worse, they lashed out at anyone who tried to fix the problems. 2 years ago, I warned the American people about what the Border Patrol agents told me, that they were catching individuals on the terrorist watch list.
So recognized.
But were the Democrats concerned when we gave them that information? No. One Democrat who serves on armed services, who represents a border state, called me a liar. Since then, more than 175 people on the terrorist watch list have been caught crossing the border. In fact, just in February, we caught more people on the terrorist watch list in 1 month than we caught in the entire 4 years of the last administration. Mr. President, thank God the Republicans are in charge today. Thank God that they're willing to do something instead of ignoring the problem but bringing a solution. I think when you run for office, you should show up for work. I think when you have a committee hearing along the border to learn the facts, stop playing politics and work for the American people. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Reserve. Continue to reserve.
Reserve.
Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Joe Biden's border crisis has become a nationwide crime scene. Cartels not only control the illegal drug market, they control our border. They're poisoning our country and exploiting every migrant who crosses our southern border. This sad crisis must end. In my district, we had the tragic story of Lizzie Murphy, who died from fentanyl poisoning at the age of 21. As in many cases, Lizzie was poisoned by just one pill, a Xanax laced with deadly fentanyl. The overdoses are also on the rise. Many of these fatalities occur from just one lethal dose of fentanyl. Just this week, we recognized National Fentanyl Awareness Day, and the CDC has reported that 2/3 of drug-related deaths involve fentanyl. Drug fatalities are now the leading cause of death for 18 to 45-year-olds, and today the House will vote to pass H.R. 2. Next, Joe Biden and Senate Democrats must change course from their deadly policies. They must pass this bill, sign it into law, and implement it. We need to secure our border, stop the cartels, and keep our community safe. That's why I'm supporting H.R. 2. However, this legislation should have gone a little further to stop the evil work of cartels. As an amendment, I offered the Lizzie Murphy Act to stop the cartels, a bill that I've previously introduced. This bill designates certain cartels as special transnational criminal organizations and implements sanctions on them and anyone who provides material support to them. We must recognize that cartels are enemies of our country and treat them that way. To disrupt their trafficking operations, we must detain or turn away all who enter our country illegally. By forcing the Biden administration to resume construction of the wall, increase Border Patrol agents, protect unaccompanied children who are at risk of trafficking, and end their foolish catch and relief practices, this Secure the Border Act of 2023 will begin to fix this crisis. I urge everyone to support it, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves, and the gentleman from New York is recognized.
Continue to reserve.
Gentleman from New York is reserved, and the gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Self, a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs.
Gentleman from Texas.
I thank my colleague for yielding the time. I rise in support of H.R. 2, Secure the Border Act of 2023, because it does just that. It secures the border. I find the comments from across the aisle rich from the very members of the party who caused the situation that our citizens are seeing on the border today. The year before the Biden administration took control of the border, CBP reported roughly 400,000 illegal border crossings. First year in office, President Biden, 1.7 million. Last year it rose to 2.8 million. I'm not sure whether that's arithmetic or logarithmic, but it is huge. Unlike many in this chamber, I visited multiple locations across the Texas border to Mexico. I saw 4 unaccompanied boys, 8 to 10 years old. What was going to happen to them? I saw rafts making multiple trips underneath the very vision of a border control location. People were helping the illegal immigrants out of the rafts and up the little cliff that we had there, to include a 1-month-old baby that had been born in Mexico. I can tell you that from being on the ground in South Texas that there is no coordinated effort to stop the flow of illegal opioids like fentanyl that kills nearly 300 Americans every day. There is no coordinated effort to stop the flow of illegal immigrants, many of whom are being trafficked as sex slaves or cheap labor. Human trafficking has now surpassed drug trafficking as the profit center for the cartels. We have indentured servanthood in this nation today, slavery by any other name. Earlier this year, I introduced the El Chapo Act, which allows us to use the billions of dollars worth of assets seized from cartel members like El Chapo to build, to build the wall. Our southern border is an unmitigated disaster, and without this bill, the ensuing chaos is going to get worse. I implore the members of this chamber.
From Texas reserves, the gentleman from New York is recognized.
I continue to reserve.
The gentleman from New York continues to reserve, and the gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser. Can you restore time, Mr. Speaker?
Yes, and.
Okay.
Gentleman from Texas has 8 minutes. The gentleman from New York has 7.5, and the gentleman from Pennsylvania is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my good friend, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee from Texas, very much. Mr. Speaker, anyone who is even slightly informed understands how dire the immigration crisis is at our southern border. And if you go to the border, as I've had a few times, Customs, Border Patrol, National Guard, local and state officials all say the same thing, that this situation is out of control and our border is not secure, and it is a human disaster. Cartels, traffickers, inform vulnerable people that are seamless to enter the United States illegally and putting people in terrible harm's way. 1/3 of women are being, Mr. Speaker, raped, according to reports. Hundreds of dying, perhaps thousands, and tons of fentanyl is coming across, killing 300, mostly young Americans a day. So what do? We have a solution. and it's called H.R. 2. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? It's real simple. A yes for H.R. 2 is for solving the border crisis, and a no is for the status quo. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Continue to reserve.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Newhouse.
The gentleman from Washington is recognized for 2 minutes.
Is it a colloquy? Yeah, it's a colloquy. Where is he? Mr. Speaker, he's going to come back, though. I reserve.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I continue to reserve.
The gentleman from New York is reserving. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me just say a few things. My friends on the other side of the aisle talk about this bill being inhumane. Really, is it humane under this administration to stuff 40 migrants in an 18-wheeler to die from heat and suffocation in my home state of Texas? Is it humane for the cartels to rape and traffic little girls? It is humane to kill 100,000 young people in this country from the poison of fentanyl. Is it humane, Mr. Speaker, to send children to stash houses in the United States to become sex slaves and child labor slaves that even Child Protective Services would find criminal? Because that is what this administration has done. You know, Susan Rice, domestic policy advisor in the New York Times, is quoted saying, she vented in a note scribbled in a memo detailing the position advocates who believed a pandemic-era border closure was compelling parents to send unaccompanied children, sometimes called UCs. In other words, what was happening because of this change of policy by the Biden administration was compelling parents to send their children by themselves in the hands of the cartels and the traffickers and the human smugglers. What does Ms. Susan Rice, Mr. Biden's domestic policy advisor, say? This is BS. She wrote, according to a copy of the memo reviewed by the Times, she says, quote, what is leading to voluntary separation of children is our generosity to these unaccompanied minors. Wow. This administration, they know exactly what they're doing. They know what this policy has done. They know the results and the consequences of rescinding the MPP program, which is called inhumane. By the way, all it says is you cannot enter the United States. You have to remain in Mexico pending your asylum claim. You know why? Because once you enter the United States, it's catch and release all over again. The first bill I introduced 20 years ago in Congress, my very first bill, was to end catch and release. And here we are, so many years later, and we're right back to it. And the sad thing is we had this thing under control, you know, with the construction of physical barriers and technology. And I think it's very, very sad personally. Recent news reports show that in a single week, almost 55,000 apprehensions by Border Patrol and more than 18,600 gotaways. Those are some of the highest totals on record. Make no mistake, the termination of Title 42 is well known among the migrants. It's well known to the drug traffickers and the cartels who make money off this racket. And they're waiting for this policy to end, to cross the border en masse. We see caravans right now, south, coming up towards my home state. It is clear the administration is not prepared and that this crisis will only get worse and devolve into chaos. As a result, the number of crossings already at historic levels will explode. This, Mr. Speaker, is unsustainable. We are facing a humanitarian crisis of generational proportions. It only benefits the cartels. I know this game too well. I was a federal prosecutor on the other side prosecuting them. They know exactly what they're doing. They exploit they terrorize, and they make a ton of money off exploiting human beings. And it's cost countless lives. At this point, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to reserve the balance of my time.
From Texas Reserves, the gentleman from New York is recognized.
Continue to reserve.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Here we go. At this point, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Newhouse.
The gentleman from Washington is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to reiterate what we've heard today, House Republicans know that border security is national security, which is why tackling this crisis truly is crucial to the fulfilling our promise to the American people and to deliver them a nation that is safe. Since President Biden took office, there have been over 5 million illegal crossings over our southern border, and more than 1.3 million people have evaded apprehension. At the same time, fentanyl is pouring over our southwest border and into our communities, into my communities, into your communities, Mr. Speaker, killing Americans at catastrophic rates. On May 11th, Title 42 is set to expire, which is only going to exacerbate the current border crisis. The President and our Democratic colleagues have offered no long-term solution. And while H.R. 2 does much to strengthen the border, it also fails to address an issue critical to our nation's farmers: reliable access to agricultural workers. We need essential reform to our immigration, asylum, and workforce laws, issues that I and many others have relentlessly been working on since being here in Congress. The United States is blessed with fertile lands and a climate conducive to agricultural productivity. However, without an adequate workforce, our farmers and our ranchers struggle to harvest and tend to their crops. This poses a direct threat to our nation's food security, our national security, and our economic prosperity. Mandating E-Verify would have a devastating impact on the American agricultural industry, including processing of agricultural products, if it were to be enacted without reforms to our agricultural labor system. They must go hand in hand.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I continue to reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to the esteemed Majority Leader of the House, Mr. Scalise. Mr. Newhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. The Majority Leader is recognized. Oh, I'm sorry. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And just to finish, they must go hand in hand. The status quo is not working for our farmers, and we must address this crisis. We cannot mandate E-Verify without stabilizing our existing agricultural workforce. Removal of the seasonality requirement from H-2A agricultural visa programs and wage reform that makes H-2A wages and benefits more market-based. With the amended legislative language, I support H.R. 2, but seek a commitment from leadership and my colleagues that we continue the important work on true legislation, bipartisan, that will resolve the workforce needs in our industry.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman.
Mr.
I'm
Speaker,
sorry, the gentleman's time has expired.
I reserve the right to close.
Gentleman has 30 seconds. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Continue to reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I reserve the right to close, Mr. Speaker. It's a hill.
Gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm ready to close.
Prepared. Recognized to close.
The foreign affairs title of this bill should be about addressing the root causes of migration, about fixing the crime, corruption, poverty, and discrimination that causes people to flee north. The men and women coming to our borders do so reluctantly. They do not want the pain of leaving parents and children behind for an unknown time while they seek refuge in an unfamiliar land. They want to see their daughters when they come home from work, not on a video call. They want to hear their siblings' voices at the dinner table, not on a Zoom. They want a way to address the root causes of migration is through aid, assistance, investment, collaboration, and the rule of law guidance. If we refuse to fund such programs and efforts, we're being a penny wise and a pound foolish, ignoring our hemispheric neighbors until they are knocking on our front door. What we need to do is address our root causes. This legislation is not aligned with national security interests or our values with our goals or curbing the migration crisis. It only exacerbates the situation on the border while reinstating the same inhumane policies that have endangered migrants. We've seen that done by the former administration. We've seen the actions, and we know who he is. And we know why he put some of those policies forward. Now, I can't close without saying that Mr. McCall, Chairman McCall, is a good man. I work with him on the committee. We talk and we debate and we do things. And so I don't want this to end without anyone thinking that I don't think that Mr. McCall is a good human being. He is. We do that together. But I do have questions. You know, I hear a lot of talk about President Biden and what he's doing or what his motivations are, et cetera. Well, I too have questions about the policies of former President Trump. Coming from New York, I have been around a lot and seen and heard his motivations, particularly as it pertains to the bills that he put forward in regards to migration. And I know of what he thinks of immigrants. I know of what the former president thinks of immigrants. Why? Because he said it. He said things that have been shocking to me, that is revealing of what he thought and why he put forward the principles that he's done. It's not me making it up. Over 34 times he called these people that are trying to come for better lives, these immigrants, over 34 times he's called them animals. That's not how we should look at our individuals, poor, running from a crisis as they are doing in Afghanistan and Ukraine and in Venezuela and other parts of Latin America. I know because I come from New York. I've seen what he's done to his own employees and how he's treated them. I know because I heard from his own mouth calling countries on the continent of Africa and in the Caribbean and South America S-hole countries. I know because he also just wanted to put a ban on people because of their religious belief. I know because even after people were convicted in the Central Park 5 in New York, he still called them vicious names. I know his motivations, and that is reflective in the policies that he's passed. That's why we should not be supporting this bill. That's not who we are as Americans. Let's fight to show the rest of the world who we really are, that we want to take care as that statue in New York City stands of that lady holding the torch. Give me your poor, give me your weary, give me your tired. That's who we became as a country, not the motivations of the former president and his policies. This bill is in the wrong direction. It's in the wrong direction. Our partners in the region are watching us very closely today. I've been talking to those leaders. I've been talking to people from the various countries in Central and South America, many of whom are in my district. This is not the way to go. I urged the members of this august body, let's not fall into the same mistakes of the past. Let's sit down and let's figure out how we can work together in a bipartisan way for a strong immigration reform bill so that we can treat humans as humans, so that we can show our actions are similar to what we pray. When we're in church or in the synagogue or a mosque, we pray for the poor, we pray for the helpless. We want to make a difference. We have an opportunity to do that. We have an opportunity to make sure that we keep our borders safe by dealing with the root causes of migration and treating people in a humane way, not just considering those in law enforcement, but thinking about the people when I see their hands on the gates asking for a better life, saying all I want to do is see my child have an opportunity, and I'm willing to go through whatever the process is. Let's think about them. Let's think about those images. Let's think about how we can do better. I yield back the balance.
And yields back. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Speaker, I yield the remainder of my time to the esteemed Majority Leader of the House, gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise.
Majority Leader is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank my friend from Texas for yielding. To respond to my friend Mr. Newhouse's question, first I want to thank you for your unwavering support for American agriculture. The industry is lucky to have such a champion as you. You've been very vocal at addressing some of the questions you have. I also want to thank you for working with us on those questions. I know you have those concerns that you brought up, but I'm glad that we've been able to work through many of those concerns. As Majority Leader, I can commit that we will continue to work with you on legislation to address the workforce needs of our agriculture industry. Mr. Speaker, we have a crisis at our nation's border. That's why we're bringing the Secure America's Border Act to the floor today. It's why the President and Secretary Mayorkas should be doing everything in their power to stop the surge that we're seeing today, maybe 10,000 people coming across illegally. That is something that Secretary Mayorkas says is not an open border. I would hate to see his description of an open border if 10,000 people coming across in one day is not. They're derelict in their duty because they have opened up the border to the tune of over 5 million people that have come into our country. That's more than my home state of Louisiana that have come into our country illegally just in the last 2 years that Joe Biden has been president. We've asked where they're going. We've asked how are they taking care of them? Who's housing them? Are the kids going to school? They don't know. In fact, the New York Times just reported that the Biden administration lost track of 85,000 young kids who have come into our country illegally. How do you lose 85,000 young kids and then say you don't have a problem and you won't work with Republicans to fix it? The president actually issued a veto threat on this bill. And what does this bill do? It secures America's border again. It ends catch and release and says, let's get back to rule of law. We are actually a nation of laws and a nation of immigrants. We can do both. But this president has abandoned the rule of law to the point where more than 5 million people have come across illegally. And what has it also done? It's brought drugs into our country. The cartels are running our southern border. Today, we're going to lose 300 young people to fentanyl deaths because President Biden opened our southern border. Yesterday, 300 young people died. Tomorrow, another 300 young people in America will die because the president opened the southern border, and he doesn't care about it. He issued a veto threat on the bill that will fix it. House Republicans are not going to sit on the sidelines. We brought a bill to the floor that everybody should vote for. Again, get back to rule of law. Give our Border Patrol agents the tools they need so that if somebody actually has an asylum claim, they can come and seek asylum the legal way. You want to come to America? We're the most generous nation in the world. Legal immigration works. When you open up the border and bring 5 million people in 2 years, it undermines the entire legal system and it breaks down communities, not just at the border, all across America. This is wreaking devastation all across America, not only the deaths, all of the other things that go with it, and the president won't fix it. Today, we can take a step to fix this problem. I urge all members to vote for this bill, and I urge the president to get engaged in working with us to solve this problem. Let's pass the bill. I yield back the balance of my time.
All times expired. Pursuant to House Resolution